For most of recorded history, we believed we were special. We believed we were singular. We believed that the story of humanity was a straight line, a clean and elegant march from primitive ancestors to the modern beings who built cities, painted masterpieces, and launched themselves into orbit around the Earth. We believed we were alone. We were wrong. The truth, as science has revealed it over the past several decades, is far stranger, far more complex, and far more humbling than anything our ancestors could have imagined. For the vast majority of our existence as a species, we were not alone on this planet. We shared it. We shared it with other humans, not other animals that looked vaguely like us, not distant cousins separated by millions of years of evolution. Other humans. Beings who walked upright, who crafted tools, who built fires, who buried their dead, who may have spoken languages, who may have told stories around flickering flames just as we did. They were here alongside us for hundreds of thousands of years, and then one by one they vanished, until only we remained. This is the story of those lost siblings, the Neanderthals who thrived in the frozen heartlands of Europe and Western Asia. The Denisovans, a ghost species known almost entirely from fragments of bone and the echoes they left in our DNA. Homo floresiensis, the astonishing small-bodied humans who lived on a remote island in Southeast Asia. Homo luzonensis, discovered so recently that the full implications of their existence are still being understood. And others, perhaps many others, whose names we do not yet know and whose bones still lie buried in caves and sediments around the world, waiting to be found. This is the story of what it means to be human, told not through the lens of our triumph, but through the lens of our loss. Because when we understand who we shared this world with and what happened to them, we begin to understand ourselves in ways that no mirror, no philosophy, and no religion has ever fully captured. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. There is a moment in childhood that many people remember. It is the moment when you first realized that the world existed before you were born, that there were days and nights, seasons and storms, entire lifetimes lived and ended long before you took your first breath. It is a disorienting feeling, a sudden expansion of perspective that changes the way you see everything. The history of human evolution offers a similar moment, but on a scale so vast that it can be difficult to fully absorb. We tend to think of ourselves, modern Homo sapiens, as the end point of a long and inevitable process. We look at the famous illustration, the one that shows a hunched ape gradually straightening up and becoming a striding modern human, and we nod. Yes, we think that is how it happened, step by step, ape to human, simple. But that illustration, as iconic as it has become, is one of the most misleading images in all of science. It suggests a linear progression, a single path from primitive to advanced, from less human to more human. It implies that each stage replaced the one before it, cleanly and completely, like chapters in a book read in order. The reality is nothing like that. The reality is a sprawling, tangled, bewildering web of species and subspecies, of migrations and isolations, of adaptations and extinctions, of meetings and matings between groups that had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years. The reality is a story with dozens of characters, most of whom we are only beginning to know and some of whom we may never know at all. The reality is that human evolution was not a ladder. It was a bush with many branches growing in many directions, some reaching toward the light and flourishing for a time, and others withering and breaking off, leaving only the faintest traces of their existence. To understand this story, we need to go back, far back. Back to a time when the genus Homo, the group of species to which we belong, was just beginning to emerge on the African continent. Back to a time when the ancestors of all known human species were taking their first uncertain steps into a world that would shape them in ways they could not possibly foresee. The genus Homo first appears in the fossil record roughly 2.5 million years ago, though the exact date and the exact species that marks the beginning are subjects of ongoing debate among paleoanthropologists. What is not debated is that from the very beginning there was diversity. There was not one kind of early human, there were several. They lived in different environments, ate different foods, developed different physical characteristics, and faced different challenges. Some had larger brains, some had more robust bodies, some were taller, some were shorter, some developed tools, some, as far as we can tell, did not. From the very start, the human story was a story of variety. This early diversity set the pattern for everything that followed. As groups of early humans spread out across Africa and eventually beyond it, they encountered vastly different environments: dense tropical forests, open savannas, coastal regions, mountain highlands, arid deserts. Each of these environments imposed its own demands, its own pressures, its own rewards and punishments. And over time, measured not in years or centuries, but in tens and hundreds of thousands of years, these pressures shaped the populations that lived within them. Bones grew thicker or thinner, bodies grew taller or shorter, brains grew larger or in some cases smaller, teeth changed shape, faces changed proportion. And slowly, imperceptibly, groups that had once been a single population became distinct from one another. They became, in the language of biology, different species. This is how evolution works, not through sudden leaps or dramatic transformations, but through the slow, patient accumulation of small changes over immense stretches of time. A population becomes isolated, perhaps by a mountain range, perhaps by a rising sea, perhaps by a shifting climate that turns a grassland into a desert. Cut off from others of their kind, they begin to change. Their genes drift, mutations accumulate, natural selection favors different traits in different environments, and after enough time has passed, the descendants of that original population are so different from their distant relatives that they can no longer interbreed with them, or if they can, the offspring are less viable, less fertile, less fit. A new species has been born. This process happened again and again throughout the history of the genus Homo. It happened in Africa, where multiple species of early humans coexisted for millions of years. It happened in Asia, where populations that had left Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago evolved in isolation, shaped by the unique environments they encountered. It happened in Europe, where the ancestors of the Neanderthals arrived perhaps 700,000 years ago and gradually adapted to a world of ice and cold that would have been utterly alien to their African forebears. The result was a world populated by many different kinds of humans, not at once perhaps and not all in the same place, but overlapping in time, overlapping in space, and overlapping in ways that we are only now beginning to understand. Consider what the world might have looked like 50,000 years ago. It is a date that feels ancient to us, but in evolutionary terms it is practically yesterday. 50,000 years ago, our own species, Homo sapiens, had already existed for at least 250,000 years. We had already developed language, art, complex social structures, and sophisticated tool-making traditions. We were already recognizably human in every meaningful sense of the word. We were not alone. In Europe and Western Asia, the Neanderthals were in their prime. They had been living in those regions for hundreds of thousands of years, far longer than our own species had existed. They were supremely adapted to their environment, with powerful, stocky bodies built to conserve heat in glacial conditions, with brains as large as or larger than our own, with tools and weapons that they had refined over countless generations. They hunted mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses. They built shelters. They controlled fire. They cared for their sick and injured. They buried their dead, sometimes with grave goods, suggesting a belief in something beyond the visible world. They were, by any reasonable definition, human. In the mountains and forests of Eastern and Central Asia, another group lived, one that we call the Denisovans. We know far less about them than we know about the Neanderthals because the physical evidence of their existence is heartbreakingly scarce. A finger bone, a few teeth, a fragment of jaw. That is almost all we have, but what we have learned from those fragments, through the revolutionary power of ancient DNA analysis, has transformed our understanding of human history. The Denisovans were a distinct group, separate from both Neanderthals and modern humans, and they occupied a vast territory across Asia for tens of thousands of years. They interbred with our ancestors, and their genetic legacy lives on today in the DNA of billions of living people. On a small island in what is now Indonesia, a truly remarkable group of humans lived in a world of their own. Homo floresiensis, discovered in a cave on the island of Flores in 2003, stunned the scientific community. These were humans who stood barely a meter tall, with brains roughly a third the size of our own. By every conventional measure of what it meant to be an advanced human, they should not have been capable of the things they clearly did. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story. They made stone tools. They hunted and butchered animals, including a species of dwarf elephant that shared their island. They used fire. They survived for tens of thousands of years in a challenging environment, adapting and thriving in ways that shattered our assumptions about the relationship between brain size and intelligence. And on another island, Luzon in the Philippines, yet another species was recently discovered. Homo luzonensis, described from fossils found in Callao Cave, is known from a small number of bones and teeth, but those fragments tell a fascinating story. This was a species with a unique combination of features, some resembling modern humans, some resembling much more ancient species, and some that are entirely its own. Like Homo floresiensis, Homo luzonensis challenges our understanding of what is possible in human evolution, of how isolation and adaptation can produce forms that defy easy categorization. These are the species we know about. There are almost certainly others that we do not. The fossil record is notoriously incomplete. bones decay, they are eaten by scavengers, they are dissolved by acidic soils, they are crushed by geological forces, they are buried so deep that no one will ever find them. For every fossil that has been discovered, countless others have been lost forever. The species we have identified represent a fraction, perhaps a small fraction, of the true diversity of the genus Homo. Every year, new discoveries are made, new fossils are unearthed, new DNA is extracted and analyzed, and the picture grows more complex. More branches are added to the bush, more characters enter the story. This is the paradigm shift that has transformed the study of human evolution in recent decades. The old model, the linear progression, the march of progress, has been replaced by something far richer and far more challenging. We now understand that human evolution was not a journey from point A to point B, it was an explosion of diversity, a radiation of species across multiple continents, each adapting to its own environment, each developing its own unique characteristics, each writing its own chapter in the larger story of what it means to be human. And perhaps the most remarkable part of this story is that these chapters overlapped. For most of our history, we were not the only humans on Earth. We were one of several, and the interactions between these different groups, the meetings, the conflicts, the matings, the exchanges of ideas and technologies, shaped the course of our evolution in ways that we are only beginning to understand. To appreciate the full scope of this story, we need to understand something about how species are defined, and how difficult that definition becomes when we are talking about organisms as complex and as variable as humans. In biology, the most commonly used definition of a species is the biological species concept, which defines a species as a group of organisms that can interbreed with one another and produce fertile offspring, but that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. By this definition, all living humans belong to a single species, Homo sapiens. We can all interbreed, we can all produce fertile children. Despite the enormous diversity of physical appearances, cultures, and languages that exist among living humans, we are all, biologically speaking, one species. But when we extend this concept back into the past, things become complicated. We know from genetic evidence that our ancestors interbred with Neanderthals. We know they interbred with Denisovans. In at least some cases, these matings produced viable, fertile offspring, because the genetic signatures of those encounters persist in living people today. If Neanderthals and Homo sapiens could interbreed and produce fertile offspring, were they really separate species? Or were they merely subspecies, varieties of a single, highly variable species? This is not just an academic question. It goes to the heart of what we mean when we say human species. And the answer, frustratingly but also fascinatingly, is that the boundaries between species are not always sharp. They can be blurry, they can be permeable. Two populations can be different enough to be considered separate species by most criteria, and yet still be capable of occasional interbreeding. This is exactly the situation we see in the later stages of human evolution, when Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans occupied overlapping territories and engaged in what scientists delicately call gene flow. The concept of a species, in other words, is a human invention. It is a useful tool for organizing the natural world, but it does not always map perfectly onto the messy reality of biology. Nature does not draw clean lines. Populations grade into one. Differences accumulate gradually, and the decision about where to draw the line between one species and another is, to some extent, a judgment call influenced by the available evidence, the analytical methods used, and the philosophical inclinations of the scientists involved. This is why the classification of fossil humans is such a contentious field. Every new discovery seems to spark a debate. Is this a new species or a variant of an existing one? Does this bone belong to a Neanderthal or something else? Is this tooth from a Denisovan or from an unknown group? These debates are not signs of confusion or failure. They are signs that the reality is genuinely complex and that our categories, while useful, are approximations of a truth that is far more nuanced than any taxonomy can capture. What we can say with confidence is that the genus Homo has included, over the past 2.5 million years, a remarkable diversity of forms. Some were tall and gracile, some were short and robust, some had enormous brains, some had small brains, some lived in tropical environments, some lived in Arctic conditions, some ate meat, some ate plants, some used sophisticated tools, some used simple ones, and they were all, in the broadest sense of the word, human. Let us begin with the species that we know best after ourselves. Let us begin with the Neanderthals. No other extinct human species has captured the popular imagination as powerfully as the Neanderthals. Their name has become a byword for brutishness and stupidity, a casual insult hurled at anyone perceived as unsophisticated or dim-witted. This reputation is profoundly unfair, and it reveals far more about our own prejudices than it does about the Neanderthals themselves. The first Neanderthal fossils were discovered in 1856 in the Neander Valley in what is now Germany. At the time, the concept of human evolution was barely formed. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species would not be published for another 3 years. The idea that humans might have evolved from earlier, different-looking ancestors was radical, even heretical. And so when these strange bones were examined, bones that were clearly human but also clearly different from any living person, they were met with a mixture of fascination and dismissal. Some scientists recognized the fossils for what they were, evidence of an ancient form of humanity that no longer existed. Others were less generous. One prominent anatomist dismissed the bones as belonging to a modern human who had been deformed by disease. Another suggested they were the remains of a Cossack soldier from the Napoleonic Wars who had crawled into the cave to die. The idea that these bones might represent a separate species of human, one that had lived alongside our ancestors and then gone extinct, was simply too radical for many to accept. Over the following decades, as more Neanderthal fossils were discovered across Europe and Western Asia, the evidence became impossible to ignore. These were not diseased modern humans. They were not Cossack soldiers. They were something else entirely. They were a distinct form of human that had occupied a vast territory, from the Atlantic coast of Europe to the mountains of Central Asia, for at least 300,000 years and possibly much longer. As the fossil record grew, so did our understanding of Neanderthal anatomy, and what emerged was a portrait of a species superbly adapted to its environment. Neanderthals were shorter than most modern humans, typically standing between 5 feet and 5 feet 6 inches tall, but they were far more heavily built. Their bones were thick and dense, with pronounced muscle attachments that indicate extraordinary physical strength. Their barrel-shaped chests housed large lungs, an adaptation to the high metabolic demands of life in cold climates. Their limbs were proportionally shorter than those of modern humans living in warmer regions, a body plan that minimizes heat loss, the same principle that explains why Arctic animals tend to be stockier than their tropical relatives. Their skulls were distinctive, with a long, low-profile, prominent brow ridges, a projecting midface, and a peculiar bony protrusion at the back of the skull called an occipital bun. Their noses were broad and projecting, with large nasal cavities that many researchers believe served to warm and humidify cold, dry air before it reached the lungs. Their jaws were strong, with large teeth that showed heavy wear, suggesting that they used their mouths as tools, gripping and pulling materials in ways that would quickly damage a modern human's dentition. And their brains were large. This is worth emphasizing because it runs counter to the popular image of the Neanderthal as a dimwit. The average Neanderthal brain was at least as large as the average modern human brain, and in many cases it was larger. Brain size alone does not determine intelligence, of course. The internal organization of the brain, the density and connectivity of neurons, the relative sizes of different brain regions, these factors matter at least as much as overall volume. But the sheer size of the Neanderthal brain should give us pause before we dismiss them as intellectually inferior. They had the raw neural hardware for complex thought. The question is what they did with it, and the archaeological record suggests that they did quite a lot. Neanderthals were skilled toolmakers. Their primary technology, known as the Mousterian industry, involved the careful preparation of stone cores from which flakes were struck and then shaped into a variety of tools: scrapers, points, knives. This technology, while less varied than the Upper Paleolithic toolkits associated with modern humans, was far from simple. It required planning, skill, and a deep understanding of the properties of different types of stone. A Neanderthal knapper had to visualize the finished tool within the raw stone, to plan a sequence of precise strikes that would remove material in the right order and at the right angle, and to adjust their technique in response to unexpected fractures or flaws. This is not the work of a brute. It is the work of an intelligent, focused, and experienced craftsperson. Some Neanderthal sites show evidence of even more sophisticated behavior. At certain locations, researchers have found tools made from materials that were not locally available, suggesting that Neanderthals either traveled long distances to obtain specific types of stone or traded with other groups. This implies a level of planning, foresight, and social organization that goes far beyond the stereotype. Neanderthals were also accomplished hunters. Analysis of their bones and the animal remains found at their sites reveals that they regularly hunted large, dangerous animals, including woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, bison, horses, and deer. They did not scavenge on the fringes. They took on the biggest and most dangerous prey available, using thrusting spears tipped with carefully crafted stone points. Isotopic analysis of Neanderthal bones confirms that meat made up a very large proportion of their diet, particularly in the colder periods when plant foods were scarce. They were apex predators, sitting at the top of the food chain in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. They used fire. This might seem unremarkable since the controlled use of fire dates back hundreds of thousands of years in the human lineage, but it is worth noting because fire is more than just a source of warmth. Fire is a technology. It is a tool for cooking food which makes nutrients more accessible and kills pathogens. It is a means of hardening wooden spears. It is a way of providing light in the darkness of a cave, extending the usable hours of the day. It is a focal point for social gathering, a place where a group comes together to eat, to rest, to interact. The consistent use of fire by Neanderthals tells us that they were not simply reacting to their environment, they were actively manipulating it. And then there's the evidence that speaks to something beyond mere survival. Evidence that hints at a capacity for symbolic thought, for culture, for what we might cautiously call a spiritual life. Neanderthals buried their dead. At numerous sites across Europe and Western Asia, archaeologists have found Neanderthal skeletons in positions and contexts that strongly suggest deliberate burial. The bodies were placed in pits, sometimes in flexed positions, sometimes on their sides. In some cases, they appear to have been accompanied by objects, stone tools, animal bones, or flowers, though the interpretation of these possible grave goods is hotly debated. The mere act of burial, however, is significant. It implies that Neanderthals had some concept of death as a meaningful event, that they felt the need to do something with the bodies of their dead rather than simply abandoning them. Whether this reflects a belief in an afterlife, a sense of grief, or simply a practical concern with hygiene is impossible to know. But it tells us that Neanderthals were not indifferent to death. They recognized it, they responded to it, and they marked it with ritual action. There's also evidence that Neanderthals cared for their sick and injured. Several Neanderthal skeletons show signs of severe injuries or chronic diseases that would have been debilitating. Broken bones that had healed, arthritis, tooth loss. In some cases, the individuals clearly survived for years or even decades after sustaining injuries that would have prevented them from hunting or foraging effectively. This can only mean that they were cared for by others, they were fed, they were protected. They were not abandoned. This is not the behavior of a species driven purely by instinct. It is the behavior of a species capable of compassion, of empathy, of recognizing the value of an individual beyond their immediate utility. Perhaps most provocatively, there is growing evidence that Neanderthals engaged in symbolic or artistic behavior. Eagle talons found at Neanderthal sites show signs of having been modified and strung together, possibly as jewelry. Pigments, particularly manganese dioxide and red ochre, have been found at numerous Neanderthal sites, often in contexts that suggest they were used for body painting or other decorative purposes. And in several caves in Spain, paintings have been found on the walls, simple geometric shapes, hand stencils, and lines that have been dated to periods when only Neanderthals are known to have been present in the region. If these dates are correct and they remain controversial, then Neanderthals were creating visual art tens of thousands of years before the famous cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira were made by modern humans. The implication of all this evidence is profound. Neanderthals were not the brutish, dim-witted cavemen of popular imagination. They were intelligent, resourceful, socially complex beings who occupied a vast territory for hundreds of thousands of years, who developed sophisticated technologies, who adapted to some of the harshest environments on Earth, and who may have possessed the capacity for symbolic thought and cultural expression. They were in every meaningful sense human, and yet they are gone. Approximately 40,000 years ago, the last Neanderthals disappeared. After hundreds of thousands of years of successful adaptation, after surviving ice ages and climate shifts in competition with countless other species, they vanished from the face of the Earth. The question of why they disappeared is one of the great mysteries of paleoanthropology, and we will return to it later. But for now, let us simply acknowledge the magnitude of the loss. A species that was our closest relative, that shared our world for tens of thousands of years, that was capable of thought and feeling and creativity, is gone. Only their bones remain, their bones and the fragments of their DNA that live on in us. If the Neanderthals are the best known of our extinct relatives, the Denisovans are the most mysterious. They are, in a very real sense, a ghost species, known not from a wealth of fossils or a rich archaeological record, but from a handful of bone fragments and the astonishing power of modern genetic analysis. The story of the Denisovans begins in a cave. Denisova Cave, located in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, is a large, multi-chambered limestone cavern that has been occupied by various human groups for at least 200,000 years. It is a remarkable site with deep sedimentary deposits that contain layers of occupation stretching back through the millennia, each layer a snapshot of a different time, a different climate, a different group of inhabitants. Neanderthals lived there, modern humans lived there, and as we now know, Denisovans lived there too. The discovery came in 2008 when Russian archaeologists excavating the cave found a small bone fragment. It was tiny, barely an inch long, and at first there was no particular reason to think it was significant. It appeared to be a fragment of a finger bone, probably from a child, and without any distinctive anatomical features that would immediately identify it as belonging to one species or another. In the old days, before the revolution in ancient DNA analysis, it might have been catalogued, stored, and largely forgotten. But these were not the old days. The fragment was sent to the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, where a team led by Svante Pääbo, one of the pioneers of ancient DNA research, extracted genetic material from the bone and sequenced it. The results were extraordinary. The DNA from the finger bone did not match modern humans. It did not match Neanderthals. It belonged to a previously unknown group of humans, a group that had diverged from the lineage leading to Neanderthals and modern humans roughly 1 million years ago. A new species, or at least a new population distinct enough to be considered a separate group, had been identified not from a skull or a skeleton, but from a fingertip and a string of genetic code. The scientific world was electrified. Here was proof that the landscape of human evolution was even more complex than anyone had suspected. A major group of humans had lived in Asia for tens or even hundreds of thousands of years, and we had known absolutely nothing about them. They had left almost no physical trace. Without the revolution in ancient DNA, we might never have known they existed at all. In the years since that initial discovery, a few additional Denisovan fossils have been found. Several teeth from Denisova cave, much larger than those of either Neanderthals or modern humans. A fragment of a lower jaw found not in Siberia but in a cave on the Tibetan plateau at an altitude of more than 10,000 feet. This jaw, known as the Zaya mandible, had been found by a Buddhist monk in 1980, decades before anyone knew what a Denisovan was, and had been kept in a local monastery. When it was finally analyzed using protein analysis, a technique that can identify species even when DNA is too degraded to recover, it was identified as Denisovan. This finding was remarkable not only because it confirmed the existence of Denisovans outside of Denisova cave, but because it showed that they had adapted to one of the most extreme environments on Earth, the high-altitude, low-oxygen world of the Tibetan plateau. And this, it turns out, is one of the most compelling aspects of the Denisovan story. Because while we know very little about what Denisovans looked like, how they lived, or what their culture was like, we know a great deal about what they left behind. They left their genes. When modern humans migrated out of Africa and into Asia, they encountered Denisovans, just as they encountered Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia. And as with the Neanderthals, they interbred. The genetic legacy of these encounters is written in the DNA of billions of living people. Populations across mainland and island Southeast Asia, Melanesia, Australia, and other regions carry significant amounts of Denisovan DNA, in some cases as much as 4 to 6% of their total genome. And this DNA is not just an inert relic. In some cases, it has been actively beneficial. One of the most striking examples involves the EPAS1 gene, sometimes called the super athlete gene. This gene plays a crucial role in the body's response to low oxygen levels, and a particular variant of it is found at very high frequencies in Tibetan populations who have lived at extreme altitudes for thousands of years. This variant helps Tibetans maintain healthy blood oxygen levels at altitudes that would cause serious health problems for most lowlanders. And this variant, genetic analysis has shown, was inherited from Denisovans. Think about what this means. Tens of thousands of years ago, Denisovans living on the Tibetan plateau adapted to the thin air of the high mountains. When modern humans arrived and interbred with them, they acquired this adaptation. And today, that Denisovan gene continues to shape the biology of millions of people, allowing them to thrive in an environment that would be challenging or dangerous for others. The Denisovans are gone, but their legacy is alive, literally, in the bodies of their descendants' descendants. Other Denisovan genes have been linked to immune function, fat metabolism, and other traits that may have helped modern human populations adapt to the diverse environments they encountered as they spread across Asia and into the Pacific. Each of these genetic contributions is a bridge across time, connecting us to a species we have never seen, whose faces we cannot reconstruct, whose voices we have never heard. They are phantoms, known only through their effect on us. The Denisovans also left behind some archaeological evidence, though interpreting it is challenging because Denisova Cave was used by multiple species over many thousands of years, making it difficult to attribute specific artifacts to specific groups. Some researchers have suggested that certain sophisticated artifacts found in Denisovan layers, including finely polished stone bracelets and bone tools, may represent Denisovan craftsmanship, but this attribution remains uncertain. What is certain is that the Denisovans were a successful and widespread group. Genetic evidence suggests that they were present across a vast territory, from Siberia to Southeast Asia, and that they persisted for a very long time. They were not a marginal population clinging to existence at the edges of the human world. They were a major player in the human story, one that we overlooked for decades simply because they left so few physical traces. The story of the Denisovans is in many ways a story about the limits and the power of scientific methods. For most of the history of paleoanthropology, we could only study extinct humans through their bones and their tools. If a species did not leave behind a rich fossil record, we would never know they existed. The Denisovans demonstrate how dramatically this has changed. A single finger bone, analyzed with the right technology, can reveal a previously unknown branch of the human family tree. A jawbone found in a monastery and analyzed with protein chemistry can extend the range of a species by thousands of miles and thousands of meters in altitude. And the DNA that flows through the veins of living people can serve as a kind of fossil in its own right, preserving the genetic memory of encounters that took place tens of thousands of years ago. This is both exhilarating and humbling. Exhilarating because it means that every new technological advance, every improvement in our ability to extract and analyze ancient DNA, has the potential to reveal entirely new chapters in the human story. Humbling because it reminds us how much we do not know and how much we may never know. The Denisovans lived for hundreds of thousands of years. They occupied a territory larger than Europe. They adapted to environments ranging from temperate forests to the roof of the world. And all we have of them is a handful of bone fragments and a constellation of genes scattered through the DNA of their distant descendants. What did they look like? We are only beginning to guess. A 2019 study used patterns of DNA methylation, chemical modifications that affect how genes are expressed, to reconstruct a rough portrait of a Denisovan face. The result was a face that was wide, with a broad jaw, a sloping forehead, and a large dental arch. Broad, robust, and yet undeniably human. But this reconstruction is tentative, based on cutting-edge but still developing methods, and it should be regarded as a first approximation rather than a definitive portrait. What did they eat? How did they organize their social groups? Did they have language? Did they create art? Did they bury their dead? We do not know, we may never know. The Denisovans are the ultimate example of a truth that runs through all of paleoanthropology. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we have not found Denisovan art does not mean they did not create it. Just because we have not found Denisovan burials does not mean they did not mourn their dead. The fossil record is capricious, preserving some things and destroying others according to the arbitrary dictates of geology and chemistry and luck. What we do know is that the Denisovans existed, that they were our relatives, that they shared our world, and that they left their mark on us in the most intimate way possible, through our genes. They are part of us, and in that sense they are not entirely gone. From the vast expanses of Asia, let us now turn to a small island in the Indonesian archipelago, where one of the most astonishing discoveries in the history of human evolution was made. Let us turn to the island of Flores and to the species known as Homo floresiensis. The story begins in 2003 in Liang Bua, a large limestone cave on the western end of Flores. An Indonesian-Australian research team had been excavating the cave for several years, digging through layers of sediment that recorded tens of thousands of years of occupation. They had found stone tools, animal bones, and evidence of fire, but they were not prepared for what they found in the deeper levels. At a depth of about 6 meters, they uncovered a skeleton. It was small, extraordinarily small. When the bones were carefully excavated and analyzed, the researchers realized that they had found the remains of an adult human who had stood approximately 3.5 feet tall, roughly the height of a modern 3-year-old child. The skull was tiny, with a brain volume of approximately 380 cubic centimeters, about the size of a grapefruit, roughly a third the volume of a modern human brain, and comparable to that of a chimpanzee. By every conventional measure, this should have been a primitive creature, perhaps an early hominin that had somehow survived in isolation on this remote island long after its relatives on the mainland had gone extinct. but the evidence told a different story. The skeleton was found in association with stone tools, sophisticated stone tools that showed evidence of careful planning and skilled execution. In the same levels, there were remains of animals that had clearly been hunted and butchered, including stegodon, a small species of elephant that had lived on Flores. There was evidence of fire use, and the dates were stunning. The skeleton appeared to be only about 60,000 years old, though subsequent work would push the range of Homo floresiensis occupation at Liang Bua back further and adjust the most recent dates to around 50,000 years ago. Even at the earlier end of this range, Homo floresiensis overlapped in time with modern Homo sapiens. This was not a relic from the deep past. This was a contemporary, a neighbor, a fellow human living in the same world at the same time. The discovery sent shockwaves through the scientific community. A human species with a brain the size of a chimpanzee's, making sophisticated tools and hunting cooperatively. It seemed impossible. It violated one of the most deeply held assumptions of paleoanthropology, that larger brains were necessary for complex behavior. Intelligence, it was believed, required a certain minimum amount of neural tissue. You needed a big brain to make good tools, to plan hunts, to control fire, to do the things that distinguished humans from other animals. And here was a species that appeared to do all of those things with a brain that, by modern standards, was absurdly small. The initial reaction, predictably, was skepticism. Some researchers argued that the skeleton was not a new species at all, but a modern human with a pathological condition, perhaps microcephaly, a disorder in which the brain fails to develop to normal size. This interpretation was vigorously debated, and over the following years it was progressively dismantled as more fossils were found, additional individuals that showed the same proportions, the same small body size, the same small brain. A pathological condition affecting a single individual was one thing. The same condition affecting an entire population over thousands of years was something else entirely. Gradually, the scientific consensus shifted. Homo floresiensis was real, it was a distinct species, and it forced us to rethink some of our most fundamental assumptions about what it means to be human. How did Homo floresiensis come to be so small? The most widely accepted explanation invokes a phenomenon known as insular dwarfism. When a population of animals becomes isolated on an island with limited resources, natural selection tends to favor smaller body size. Smaller individuals need less food, less water, less space. They can survive on the limited resources of an island environment more easily than their larger relatives. Over many generations, the population shrinks. This phenomenon has been observed in many species, from elephants to deer to hippopotamuses. The dwarf elephants of the Mediterranean islands, which stood barely 4 feet tall, are a classic example. It appears that the same process operated on the ancestors of Homo floresiensis. Some population of earlier humans, perhaps Homo erectus, which is known to have lived in the region, arrived on Flores and became isolated. Over hundreds of thousands of years, natural selection favored smaller and smaller body size until the population had dwarfed to the astonishing dimensions seen in the Liang Bua fossils. The brain shrank along with the body, as it typically does in cases of insular dwarfism, though not in strict proportion. The resulting species was tiny but, as the archaeological evidence shows, still highly capable. This last point deserves emphasis. The tools found in association with Homo floresiensis are not crude. They are not random. They show evidence of systematic manufacture using techniques that require planning, spatial reasoning, and fine motor control. The cores from which flakes were struck were carefully prepared. The flakes themselves were shaped and retouched to create specific tool types. This is not the work of a cognitively limited species fumbling with rocks. It is the work of a species that understood the properties of stone, that could visualize a desired outcome, and that could execute a complex sequence of steps to achieve it. The hunting evidence is equally impressive. Stegodon, the dwarf elephant that shared Flores with Homo floresiensis, was a significant animal, much larger than the humans who hunted it. Killing and butchering a stegodon would have required coordination, communication, and planning. It would have required tools for cutting through thick hide and dismembering heavy carcasses. It would have required a means of transporting the meat back to a processing site. All of these activities imply cognitive abilities that go far beyond what a chimpanzee-sized brain might be expected to produce. This is one of the most important lessons of Homo floresiensis. Brain size, as a crude measure of intelligence, is unreliable. What matters is not just how big a brain is, but how it is organized. Modern neuroscience has shown that intelligence depends on the density and connectivity of neurons, on the relative sizes of different brain regions, on the efficiency of neural processing, not simply on total volume. A A small but efficiently organized brain may be capable of feats that a larger but less efficiently organized brain cannot match. Homo floresiensis may have had a brain the size of a grapefruit, but that brain was evidently organized in a way that permitted complex tool manufacture, cooperative hunting, and long-term survival in a challenging environment. The discovery also raises profound questions about the diversity that once existed within the genus Homo. If a species this different from us, this small-brained, could exist as recently as 50,000 years ago, what else might have been out there? How many other pockets of human diversity existed on islands, in valleys, in mountain ranges, in regions of the world that have not yet been systematically explored by archaeologists? Homo floresiensis was discovered in a single cave on a single island. How many other caves on other islands contain similar surprises? The people who lived alongside Homo floresiensis, the modern humans who eventually arrived on Flores, must have encountered them. What did they make of these small, strange beings who looked human but were not quite like them? Did they trade? Did they fight? Did they tell stories about the little people who lived in the forests and the caves? It is impossible to know, but it is tantalizing to speculate. Many cultures around the world have legends of small, magical, forest-dwelling beings, elves, dwarves, sprites, and other little folk who live just beyond the edge of human society. Could some of these legends preserve, in distorted and mythologized form, the memory of actual encounters between modern humans and species like Homo floresiensis? It is a romantic idea and probably unprovable, but it reminds us that the past is not always as distant as it seems. If Homo floresiensis was a revelation, the discovery of Homo luzonensis was a confirmation. A confirmation that the islands of Southeast Asia were a crucible of human diversity, a region where isolation and adaptation produced forms of humanity that we had never imagined. In 2007, a team of archaeologists working in Callao Cave on the island of Luzon in the Philippines found a small bone. It was a metatarsal, one of the bones of the foot, and it appeared to be human. Radiocarbon dating and uranium series dating placed it at approximately 67,000 years old. The bone was small, consistent with a small-bodied individual, and it had a combination of features that did not quite match any known species of Homo. Over the following years, more fossils were found in the same cave: teeth, hand bones, and foot bones, representing at least 3 individuals, 2 adults and 1 child. The formal description of Homo luzonensis was published in 2019, and it added yet another branch to the increasingly bushy family tree of humanity. Homo luzonensis is known from a frustratingly small number of fossils, and no skull has been found, which limits our ability to reconstruct its appearance and estimate its brain size. But the bones and teeth that have been recovered tell a fascinating story. The teeth are small, some of them very small, smaller than those of any other known species of Homo. The premolars have 2 or 3 roots, a feature that is rare in modern humans and Neanderthals but common in much older species like Homo erectus and the Australopithecines. The hand and foot bones show a mosaic of features, some resembling modern humans, some resembling Australopithecines, and some that are unique to Homo luzonensis. The foot bones in particular suggest that this species retained a significant capacity for climbing, with curved toe bones that would have allowed them to grip branches and navigate arboreal environments. This combination of features is unusual and difficult to explain. It suggests that Homo luzonensis was not simply a dwarfed version of a known species, as Homo floresiensis may have been a dwarfed version of Homo erectus. Instead, it appears to represent a unique evolutionary trajectory, a species that developed its own distinctive suite of adaptations in response to the particular conditions of its island home. The existence of Homo luzonensis on Luzon raises the same questions that Homo floresiensis raises on Flores, but with an additional layer of complexity. How did the ancestors of Homo luzonensis get to Luzon in the first place? Luzon, unlike some other islands in the archipelago, was never connected to the Asian mainland by a land bridge, at least not during the relevant time periods. To reach Luzon, the ancestors of Homo luzonensis would have had to cross a significant body of open water. Did they do so intentionally on rafts or boats, or were they carried by accident, swept out to sea by a storm or a tsunami, and washed up on the shores of an unfamiliar island? If they crossed the water intentionally, it would imply a level of cognitive and technological sophistication that we might not expect from a species with archaic features. If they arrived by accident, it would be an extraordinary stroke of luck, a chance event that led to the colonization of an entirely new environment and the evolution of an entirely new species. Similar questions apply to Homo floresiensis on Flores. The ancestors of that species also had to cross water to reach their island home. Together, these two discoveries suggest that the ability to cross water barriers, whether intentionally or accidentally, may have been more common among archaic human species than we previously thought. And they suggest that islands, with their isolation and their unique environmental pressures, may have been factories of human diversity, producing species after species after species that adapted to local conditions and diverged from their mainland relatives. How many such island species existed? We have discovered 2 in the past 2 decades, on 2 islands in a vast archipelago that contains thousands more. The Indonesian and Philippine archipelagos span an enormous area, with islands of every size and description, from tiny atolls to massive landmasses. Each island is a potential laboratory for evolution, a potential home for a unique form of humanity. The odds that we have found all the island human species that ever existed are essentially zero. The discoveries of Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis have expanded our understanding of human diversity in ways that were literally unimaginable a generation ago, but they are part of a larger pattern, a pattern that extends far beyond the islands of Southeast Asia. Consider Homo erectus, one of the most successful human species that ever lived. Homo erectus first appeared in Africa roughly 2 million years ago and subsequently spread across much of the Old World, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the islands of Indonesia. It persisted for an extraordinarily long time, possibly as recently as 100,000 years ago in some regions. Homo erectus was the first human species to leave Africa, the first to use fire regularly, and the first to develop the kind of symmetrical, carefully shaped stone tools known as hand axes, which remained in use, with remarkably little change, for more than 1 million years. The longevity and geographic range of Homo erectus are staggering. This was a species that endured for nearly 2 million years, through ice ages and warm periods, through droughts and floods, through the rise and fall of entire ecosystems. It occupied environments ranging from tropical rainforests to temperate woodlands to arid grasslands. It was by any measure an extraordinarily successful species, and it may well have been the ancestor of many of the later human species, including Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, and possibly even ourselves. But Homo erectus was not alone during its long tenure on Earth. In Africa, other species of Homo coexisted with it, including Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and later, Homo heidelbergensis or Homo rhodesiensis, depending on which naming scheme one follows. The relationships between these species are unclear and hotly debated, but their coexistence is not. For much of the past 2 million years, Africa hosted multiple species of human at the same time. They may have competed for resources, they may have avoided each other, they may have interacted in ways that left no trace in the archaeological record, but they were there, sharing a continent, sharing a world, and in some cases they shared specific landscapes. At certain sites in East Africa, fossils from different human species have been found in the same geological formations, dating to the same time periods. At Kubaifora in Kenya, for example, fossils of Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and Homo erectus have all been found in deposits dating to roughly the same era. They may not have been living side by side, but they were close enough in time and space that their lives were probably intertwined in some way. This pattern of coexistence challenges one of our deepest intuitions about humanity, the idea that there can be only one. We look at the world today and see a single human species, Homo sapiens, and we assume that this is the natural state of affairs, that the world is only big enough for one kind of human. But the fossil record tells us that this is an anomaly, not the norm. For most of the past 2 million years, multiple human species coexisted. Our current situation, in which one species of human dominates the entire planet, is the exception, not the rule. It is a recent development, an artifact of the last 40 to 50,000 years, and it raises a question that is at once simple and profound. Why us? Why are we the ones who survived? Why did Homo sapiens persist while Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo luzonensis, Homo erectus, and all the others disappeared? What was it about our species, about our biology, our behavior, our culture, our luck, that allowed us to outlast all the rest? These are questions we will explore in depth, but before we do, there is another aspect of this story that demands our attention: the genetic evidence of interbreeding between different human species and what it tells us about the nature of species boundaries and the interconnectedness of the human family. The idea that modern humans might have interbred with other human species is not new. It was proposed decades ago, based on the observation that some fossils seem to show a mixture of modern and archaic features, as if they represented hybrids between different groups. but for a long time this idea remained speculative. The fossil evidence was ambiguous, and there was no way to test the hypothesis directly. That changed with the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome. In 2010, Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute published the first draft of the Neanderthal genome, assembled from DNA extracted from 3 Neanderthal bones found in a cave in Croatia. It was a monumental achievement, the culmination of more than 20 years of work to develop the techniques needed to recover and sequence DNA from ancient bones. The technology required was extraordinary. Ancient DNA is degraded, fragmented, and contaminated with the DNA of bacteria, fungi, and the modern humans who handled the specimens. Extracting meaningful genetic information from such material required levels of sensitivity and precision that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier, but the results were worth the effort. When the Neanderthal genome was compared to the genomes of living humans from around the world, a remarkable pattern emerged. People of European and Asian descent carried, on average, about 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. People of purely African descent whose ancestors had not migrated into the regions where Neanderthals lived carried essentially none. The implication was clear. When modern humans left Africa and spread into Europe and Asia, they encountered Neanderthals, and they did not merely coexist with them. They mated with them. The offspring of these unions survived and reproduced, and their Neanderthal genes were passed down through the generations, diluted by time but never entirely lost. Today, roughly 40% of the total Neanderthal genome has been preserved, distributed in small fragments across the genomes of living non-African humans. No single individual carries all of these fragments, but collectively, the living carry a substantial portion of the Neanderthal genetic heritage. This discovery was transformative. It meant that the Neanderthals were not simply an extinct side branch of the human family tree. They were our ancestors in a direct and literal sense. Their genes are our genes. Their biological legacy lives in us. The boundary between Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis, which had seemed so clear-cut, was in fact porous. Gene flow had occurred between the two species, and the results of that gene flow were still visible, still functional, still shaping the biology of billions of living people. Similar findings followed for the Denisovans. When the Denisovan genome was sequenced and compared to those of living humans, it became clear that interbreeding had occurred between Denisovans and modern humans as well. The highest levels of Denisovan ancestry are found in populations of Melanesia, Australia, and the Philippines, where Denisovan DNA can account for 4 to 6% of the genome. Lower but still significant levels are found in populations across mainland Asia and the Americas, and the picture has continued to grow more complex. Analysis of the Denisovan genome itself revealed that the Denisovans had interbred with an even more archaic group, a population that split from the main human lineage more than 1 million years ago, and for which we have no fossil evidence at all. This super-archaic DNA, as it has been called, represents yet another layer of the human genetic palimpsest, another ghost in the machine, another reminder that the human family tree is more web than tree. The genetic evidence has also revealed multiple episodes of interbreeding. It was not a single event, a single encounter between modern humans and Neanderthals or Denisovans. It happened multiple times, in multiple locations, over thousands of years. Some populations of modern humans have genetic signatures indicating that their ancestors interbred with Denisovans on at least 2 separate occasions, suggesting encounters with different Denisovan populations in different parts of Asia. What did these encounters look like? We can only speculate. Did small bands of modern humans and Neanderthals meet at the edges of their territories, cautiously, curiously, perhaps warily? Did they trade? Did they share food? Did individuals from one group join the other, whether by choice or by force? We do not know. The genetic evidence tells us that the encounters happened and that they produced offspring. It does not tell us the stories behind those encounters, the human dramas of attraction and suspicion, of curiosity and fear that must have played out when 2 different kinds of human met for the first time. But we can say this: the fact that interbreeding occurred and that the resulting offspring survived and thrived tells us something important about the nature of the differences between these species. However different Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans may have looked, however different their cultures and behaviors may have been, they were similar enough, biologically and perhaps psychologically, to recognize each other as potential mates. The differences were real, but they were not absolute. The boundaries were there, but they could be crossed. This is a profound insight because it challenges the notion that species boundaries are sharp and impermeable. In the case of human evolution, the boundaries were fuzzy. Different groups diverged, adapted to different environments, developed different physical characteristics, but retained the ability to interbreed. The result was a complex web of genetic exchange, a network of connections that linked different human populations across vast distances and vast stretches of time. And this web of connections has left a lasting legacy. Neanderthal and Denisovan genes do not just sit passively in the genomes of living humans. In many cases, they have been actively selected for, meaning that they conferred some advantage that caused them to increase in frequency over time. We have already mentioned the Denisovan EPAS1 gene and its role in high-altitude adaptation, but there are many other examples. Some Neanderthal genes are involved in immune function, helping the body recognize and fight off infections. When modern humans first arrived in Europe and Asia, they encountered a world full of pathogens to which they had no natural defenses. Interbreeding with Neanderthals, who had lived in these environments for hundreds of thousands of years and had evolved immune responses to local diseases, provided a crucial shortcut. By acquiring Neanderthal immune genes, modern humans could defend themselves against diseases that might otherwise have devastated their populations. This is a remarkable example of adaptive introgression, the process by which genes from one species enter the gene pool of another through hybridization and are then favored by natural selection. Other Neanderthal genes have been linked to skin and hair characteristics, to fat metabolism, to the body's response to cold, and to various aspects of the nervous system. Some of these genes appear to be beneficial, others may be neutral. And some appear to be harmful, associated with increased risk of certain diseases, including depression, blood clotting disorders, and autoimmune conditions. The legacy of interbreeding, like the legacy of any complex genetic inheritance, is mixed. It contains both gifts and burdens. The overall picture that emerges from the genetic evidence is one of interconnectedness. Modern humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and possibly other groups were not isolated branches on a tree, developing in parallel without contact. They were nodes in a network, connected by gene flow, exchanging genetic material in a process that enriched and complicated the genomes of all involved. The human family tree, viewed through the lens of genetics, looks less like a tree and more like a braided river, with streams separating and rejoining, diverging and converging, carrying different genetic payloads from different sources and mixing them together in ever-changing combinations. This is the modern understanding of human evolution, and it is radically different from the simple, linear model that prevailed just a few decades ago. We are not the product of a single lineage, marching steadily from the past to the present. We are the product of many lineages, woven together by the accidents of migration, the pressures of natural selection, and the undeniable human impulse to connect with others, even others who are not quite like us. Understanding the world in which these different human species lived requires understanding the world itself, and how dramatically it has changed over the past few 100,000 years. The Earth of 50,000 years ago, or 100,000 years ago, or 300,000 years ago was a very different place from the Earth of today. Climate was not stable. It swung between extremes, from ice ages that covered much of the northern hemisphere in glaciers miles thick, to warm interglacial periods that were sometimes warmer than today. These swings were not gentle. They were dramatic, sometimes rapid, and they reshaped the environments in which human species lived, driving them to adapt, to migrate, or to die. During glacial periods, enormous amounts of water were locked up in ice sheets, causing sea levels to drop by more than 100 meters in some cases. Land bridges appeared where there had been ocean. Islands merged with the mainland. Coastlines extended far beyond their present positions. The geography of the world was transformed, and with it, the connections and barriers between different human populations. Conversely, during interglacial periods, the ice melted, sea levels rose, and land bridges were submerged. Populations that had been connected were separated. Islands that had been extensions of the mainland became isolated, and the species living on those islands were cut off from gene flow, from competition, and from the influences that had shaped them on the mainland. They were free to evolve in their own directions, driven by the unique pressures of their island environments. This cycle of connection and isolation, of expansion and contraction, of bridging and separation, was one of the primary engines of human diversity. It created the conditions in which new species could emerge and in which existing species could diverge from one another. And it created the conditions in which those species would eventually meet again, when changing climates reopened corridors of migration and brought together populations that had been separated for tens or hundreds of thousands of years. The environments that these different human species inhabited were diverse almost beyond description. Neanderthals lived in a world of boreal forests, open steppe, and tundra, a world shaped by proximity to the great ice sheets of northern Europe. In the depths of the glacial periods, temperatures in their territories plunged far below zero, and the landscape was a frozen wasteland for much of the year. In the warmer periods between glaciations, the same regions became temperate forests, rich in game and plant life. Neanderthals had to adapt to both extremes, and the archaeological record shows that they did, adjusting their diets, their hunting strategies, and their use of the landscape in response to changing conditions. Denisovans, as far as we can tell from the limited evidence, occupied a similarly diverse range of environments, from the cold, high-altitude landscapes of Siberia and Tibet to the warmer, lower-elevation regions of mainland Southeast Asia. The fact that they adapted to such a wide range of conditions suggests a degree of behavioral flexibility that we are only beginning to appreciate. Homo floresiensis lived in a tropical island environment with its own unique challenges and opportunities. Flores is a rugged, mountainous island with a tropical climate, dense vegetation, and a limited suite of animal species. The ecological community of Flores was shaped by its isolation, with many species found nowhere else on Earth. Homo floresiensis was part of this unique community, a small predator in a world of other endemic species, including the dwarf stegodon, giant rats, and Komodo dragons. Homo luzonensis lived in a similar island setting, on the much larger island of Luzon, which nonetheless imposed its own set of evolutionary pressures. The combination of isolation, limited resources, and unique ecological communities created the conditions for the evolution of a species that was unlike anything found on the mainland. Each of these environments shaped its inhabitants in specific ways, selecting for traits that improved survival and reproduction in that particular setting. Body size, body proportions, brain size, metabolic rate, diet, locomotion, all of these were subject to the relentless pressure of natural selection, which favored individuals best suited to their local conditions and eliminated those who were not. The result was a diversity of human forms that reflected the diversity of environments in which they lived. And this diversity, it must be emphasized, was not a failure of evolution. It was not a sign that the human lineage had gone wrong or that some species were more successful than others in some absolute sense. It was a sign that the genus Homo was doing what all successful groups of organisms do, radiating, diversifying, adapting, filling available niches, and evolving solutions to the specific challenges of specific environments. The diversity of the genus Homo was its strength, not its weakness. It was evidence of a lineage that was adaptable, flexible, and capable of thriving in a remarkable range of conditions. The fact that only one species survives today should not blind us to the richness that once existed. Our current solitude is not a natural state. It is an artifact of recent history, a consequence of processes that are still poorly understood. For most of the time that the genus Homo has existed, diversity was the rule. Uniformity, the situation we see today, is the exception. Let us return now to the question of what these different species were like, not just physically, but behaviorally. We have talked about their anatomy, their tools, their environments, but what were they like as beings? What was it like to be a Neanderthal or a Denisovan or a member of Homo floresiensis? What did they think about? What did they feel? What did they know? These are questions that science, by its nature, struggles to answer. Thoughts and feelings do not fossilize. Emotions leave no trace in the sedimentary record. Language, if it existed, vanished with the breath that carried it. We are left to infer the inner lives of extinct humans from the material traces they left behind, their tools, their art, their treatment of the dead, the patterns of their daily lives as reconstructed from archaeological evidence. And yet those material traces can be surprisingly eloquent. Consider the Neanderthal burials we discussed earlier. The act of burial itself, of deliberately placing a dead body in the ground and covering it with earth or stones, is a behavior that requires a certain conceptual framework. It requires the understanding that death is a state, a transition from one condition to another. It requires the impulse to do something about death, to mark it in some way, to treat the dead body differently from other objects. Whether this impulse stems from grief, from fear, from spiritual belief, or from some other motivation, it speaks to a mental world that is recognizably complex, recognizably human. The care of the sick and injured, which we see in Neanderthal populations, speaks to a similar complexity. An individual who is severely injured and cannot hunt or forage is, in cold economic terms, a burden on the group. Caring for such an individual requires the expenditure of resources, food, water, protection that could be directed elsewhere. A purely instinctive species, driven solely by the imperatives of survival and reproduction, might be expected to abandon such individuals. The fact that Neanderthals did not, that they kept their injured and sick alive for years, implies a social bond that transcended simple utility. It implies that the value of an individual to a Neanderthal group was not measured solely by their productive capacity. It implies something that, at the risk of being sentimental, we might call love. The possible use of pigments by Neanderthals is another tantalizing clue. If Neanderthals used manganese dioxide and red ochre to paint their bodies or their surroundings, they were engaging in symbolic behavior. They were using material substances to represent something beyond their physical properties. A streak of red ochre on a body is not a tool. It does not help you hunt or gather or build a shelter. It serves a symbolic function, marking an individual as a member of a group, signaling a status or an identity, expressing an aesthetic preference or a spiritual belief. Symbolic behavior is one of the hallmarks of modern human cognition, and if Neanderthals engaged in it, it blurs the line between their mental world and ours. Similarly, the eagle talon jewelry found at some Neanderthal sites suggests an appreciation for ornament, for beauty, for the symbolic significance of objects. An eagle talon is not useful as a tool. It is not edible. Its value is aesthetic and symbolic. Wearing a string of eagle talons around your neck says something about who you are, about your prowess as a hunter, about your place in the social order, about your connection to the natural world. It is a statement, and making statements through material objects is a fundamentally human activity. The question of whether Neanderthals had language is one of the most debated in all of paleoanthropology. Language is arguably the single most important human adaptation. It allows the transmission of complex information, the coordination of group activities, the planning of future actions, the preservation of cultural knowledge across generations, and the creation of shared narratives that bind individuals into communities. If Neanderthals had language, even a simpler form of language than our own, they were fundamentally different from any non-human animal that has ever lived. The evidence is indirect and ambiguous. Neanderthals possessed a gene called FOXP2, which is associated with language ability in modern humans. Mutations in this gene cause severe speech and language disorders. The Neanderthal version of FOXP2 is identical to the modern human version, which some researchers interpret as evidence that Neanderthals had the genetic basis for language. But FOXP2 is just one gene among many that contribute to language ability, and possessing the gene is not the same as possessing the full suite of cognitive and anatomical adaptations required for fluent speech. Anatomically, Neanderthal vocal tracts appear to have been capable of producing a range of speech sounds, though there is debate about whether their range was as great as that of modern humans. Their hyoid bone, a small bone in the throat that supports the tongue and is involved in speech production, is similar in shape and position to that of modern humans. This suggests that the anatomical apparatus for speech was present, even if we cannot be certain that it was used for speech. The behavioral evidence is also suggestive. Neanderthals engaged in activities that would seem to require some form of communication, whether verbal or not. They hunted large, dangerous animals cooperatively, which requires coordination. They manufactured tools using techniques that would seem to require instruction, the transmission of knowledge from skilled practitioners to novices. They maintained social networks across large areas, as evidenced by the transport of materials over long distances. All of these activities would be easier and in some cases might be impossible without some form of language, but we cannot be certain. The gap between the evidence we have and the conclusions we would like to draw is too large. Perhaps Neanderthals had a fully developed language, as complex and expressive as any modern human language. Perhaps they had a simpler system of communication, a proto-language consisting of a limited number of calls, gestures, and sounds. Perhaps they had something in between, a form of communication that served their needs perfectly well, but that would seem limited to us. We do not know, and we may never know. Language, the most human of all human traits, is also the most ephemeral. It exists only in the moment of its utterance, and then it is gone. What we can say is that the Neanderthals, and probably the other extinct human species as well, were not the simple, instinct-driven creatures that older models of human evolution suggested. They were complex beings capable of sophisticated behavior, social organization, and possibly symbolic thought. They were not us, but they were not entirely unlike us either. They occupied a space in the spectrum of human cognitive ability that overlaps with our own in ways that are both comforting and challenging. Comforting because they remind us that we are not alone in our capacity for thought and feeling. Challenging because they force us to ask what exactly distinguishes us from them, and whether the differences that do exist are as significant as we have assumed. The question of what makes Homo sapiens unique, what sets us apart from all the other human species that have existed, is one of the central questions of paleoanthropology. It is also one of the most difficult to answer, because the answer depends on what criteria we use and what evidence we consider. If we look at the archaeological record, the most obvious difference between Homo sapiens and other human species is the explosion of cultural innovation that occurred within our species, particularly in the last 100,000 years. This period saw the development of complex art, including painting, sculpture, and music. It saw the invention of new technologies, including bone tools, projectile weapons, and sewing needles. It saw the creation of personal ornaments, beads, pendants, and other items of jewelry that served no practical purpose but expressed identity, status, and group membership. It saw the development of long-distance trade networks, the domestication of fire for a wider range of purposes, and the colonization of every major landmass on Earth, including the challenging environments of the Arctic, the deserts, and the high mountains. This burst of innovation, sometimes called the creative explosion or the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, is often cited as evidence that Homo sapiens possessed a cognitive capacity that other human species lacked. Some researchers have argued that we underwent a neurological or genetic change around 50 to 100,000 years ago that gave us the capacity for fully modern behavior, including symbolic thought, abstract reasoning, and innovation. This change, whatever its cause, allowed us to develop culture at a rate and to a degree that our competitors could not match. But this interpretation has been challenged in recent years. As we have seen, Neanderthals engaged in some forms of symbolic behavior, including the use of pigments, the creation of ornaments, and possibly the production of cave art. Homo floresiensis made sophisticated tools with a brain a third the size of our own. The line between modern and archaic behavior is not as sharp as it once seemed. An alternative view holds that the differences between Homo sapiens and other human species were not qualitative but quantitative. We did not possess a fundamentally different kind of mind. We possessed the same basic cognitive toolkit, but we used it more extensively, more flexibly, and more creatively. Our innovation was not a sudden mutation, but a gradual accumulation, driven by larger population sizes, more extensive social networks, and a greater capacity for cultural transmission, the ability to learn from others and to build on the knowledge of previous generations. This view is supported by the observation that the creative explosion did not happen all at once. The archaeological record shows a gradual increase in behavioral complexity over the past 300,000 years, with different innovations appearing at different times and in different places. Personal ornaments appear in Africa more than 100,000 years ago. Pigment use appears even earlier. Complex tool technologies develop incrementally, not in a single revolutionary leap. The full suite of modern behaviors that characterizes the Upper Paleolithic emerges over tens of thousands of years, not overnight. This interpretation is correct, then what distinguished Homo sapiens from other human species was not a single trait or a single mutation, but a suite of interrelated advantages. A slightly more flexible mind, a slightly greater capacity for social learning, a slightly larger population size that maintained a larger pool of innovations, and a slight tendency to form larger and more connected social networks that allowed innovations to spread more rapidly and to be preserved more reliably. None of these advantages individually would have been decisive, but together, accumulated over time, they may have given Homo sapiens a competitive edge that, over tens of thousands of years, proved insurmountable. This is speculative, of course. The truth is that we do not fully understand why Homo sapiens survived and other human species did not. The answer is almost certainly complex, involving a combination of biological, cultural, ecological, and perhaps just plain lucky factors that are difficult to disentangle from each other or to test against the fragmentary evidence of the archaeological and fossil records. What we can say is that the triumph of Homo sapiens was not inevitable. It was not predetermined. There was no cosmic law that guaranteed that our species would outlast all the others. The Neanderthals survived for 300,000 years before we even existed. Homo erectus persisted for nearly 2 million years. These were not failed experiments. They were successful species, magnificently adapted to their environments, capable of complex behavior, and resilient in the face of enormous environmental challenges. Their disappearance was not a foregone conclusion. It was a contingency, the result of specific circumstances that unfolded in specific ways at specific times. And this contingency is humbling. It reminds us that our dominance of the planet is not the result of some inherent superiority, but of a particular set of historical accidents. If the climate had shifted differently, if our ancestors had taken a different route out of Africa, if a crucial innovation had been lost instead of preserved, if a key population had been wiped out by disease or famine at a critical moment, the story might have ended very differently. We might have been the ones who disappeared, and the Neanderthals or the Denisovans or some other species might be the ones wondering what happened to us. This brings us to one of the most poignant aspects of this entire story, the question of what happened to the other human species. Why did they disappear? What drove them to extinction? And what role, if any, did our own species play in their demise? These questions will be explored at great length in the second part of this documentary, but even here at the end of the first part, it is worth acknowledging the weight of the mystery. Because the disappearance of the other human species is not just a scientific puzzle, it is a tragedy. It is the loss of entire worlds of experience, entire ways of being human, entire lineages of thought and feeling and culture that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years and then were simply gone. We know when most of the extinctions occurred, at least approximately. The Neanderthals disappeared around 40,000 years ago, roughly coinciding with the arrival of modern humans in their territories. Homo floresiensis disappeared around 50,000 years ago, again roughly coinciding with the arrival of modern humans in the region. The Denisovans disappeared at a time that is less precisely known, but that also appears to overlap with the expansion of modern humans. The coincidence is suspicious. In each case, a long-established human species disappeared shortly after modern humans arrived in its territory. This pattern has led many researchers to conclude that the arrival of Homo sapiens was, directly or indirectly, the primary cause of the extinction of other human species. Whether through competition for resources, through violence, through the introduction of new diseases, or through some combination of these factors, the arrival of modern humans appears to have been a death sentence for their relatives. But the picture is more complicated than this simple narrative suggests. The extinctions did not happen overnight. They played out over thousands of years. In some regions, Neanderthals persisted for thousands of years after modern humans first arrived. In others, the overlap appears to have been brief. The pattern is not one of sudden, violent replacement, but of gradual decline, a slow contraction of populations and territories over many generations. Environmental factors also played a role. The period during which the other human species disappeared was a time of dramatic environmental change. The climate was swinging between glacial and interglacial conditions, reshaping ecosystems and redistributing the resources on which all species depended. It is possible that these environmental changes weakened other human populations, reducing their numbers and their resilience, and that the arrival of modern humans was simply the final stressor in a process that was already underway. It is also possible that interbreeding played a role. If modern humans and other species interbred, and if the offspring were sometimes absorbed into modern human populations, then the genes of the other species might have been gradually diluted into the larger, more numerous Homo sapiens gene pool. In this scenario, the other species did not so much go extinct as dissolve, their genes gradually merging into the expanding modern human population until no pure populations of the other species remained. The truth, as always, is probably some combination of all these factors, varying from region to region and from species to species. The extinction of the other human species was not a single event with a single cause. It was a complex, multifaceted process that played out differently in different places, and that was driven by a combination of ecological, biological, and cultural factors. What is clear is that the result was unprecedented. For the first time in the history of the genus Homo, a single species dominated the entire planet. For the first time, there was only one kind of human. We had become, for better or for worse, alone, but we carry the others with us, in our bones, which bear the marks of evolutionary processes shared with species that diverged from us hundreds of thousands of years ago. In our genes, which contain fragments of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, silent testaments to encounters that took place in the deep past. In our imagination, which is haunted by the possibility that the world was once populated by other kinds of humans, beings who were like us and yet different, who saw the same stars and walked the same earth and felt the same wind on their faces. We are the last humans, but we are not the only humans who ever were. And understanding who those other humans were, how they lived, how they died, and what they left behind is not just an academic exercise. It is an act of remembrance, a way of honoring the diversity of forms that the human experiment has taken, and a way of understanding ourselves more fully by understanding the broader context from which we emerged. The story is far from over. New fossils are being discovered every year. new genomes are being sequenced. New analytical techniques are being developed that allow us to extract information from ever smaller and ever more degraded specimens. The picture of human evolution is being filled in, detail by detail, pixel by pixel, and with each new discovery, the story grows richer, more complex, and more surprising. We do not yet know how many human species there were. We do not know all the places they lived, all the things they did, all the ways they interacted with each other and with us. We do not know why some flourished and others faltered, why some adapted and others could not, why some left descendants and others left only bones. But we know this: they were real, they lived, they breathed, they looked up at the night sky and saw the same stars we see. They felt the cold of winter and the warmth of fire. They knew hunger and satisfaction, fear and courage, loneliness and companionship. They were human in their own way, in their own time, in their own place. And their story is part of our story, inseparable from it, woven into the very fabric of who and what we are. In the second part of this documentary, we will explore the decline and disappearance of these other human species in greater detail. We will examine the evidence for competition, conflict, and coexistence. We will look at the environmental forces that shape their fate. We will consider the role of disease, of climate change, of technological innovation, and of simple chance. And we will ask what the loss of these species means for us, the survivors, the ones who are left to tell their story and to wonder about a world in which we were not alone. But for now, let us sit with the knowledge of what was. Let us take a moment to contemplate the richness of the human world as it once existed, a world populated by many kinds of human, each unique, each adapted, each worthy of our attention and our respect. Let us remember that the solitude we feel today, the sense of being the only humans on a vast and indifferent planet, is not the way things have always been. For most of our history, we had company, and the nature of that company, the identities and the stories of those who walked alongside us, is one of the most extraordinary tales that science has ever told. It is a tale of bone and stone, of cave and glacier, of island and continent. It is a tale of adaptation and extinction, of divergence and convergence, of separation and reunion. It is a tale written in the language of DNA, spoken in the silence of abandoned caves, and illustrated by the tools and ornaments of people who lived and died in worlds we can barely imagine. It is the tale of when we were not alone, and it is a tale that is just beginning to be told. The journey through the lost worlds of our closest relatives has only just begun. We have met the Neanderthals, those powerful, intelligent, culturally complex beings who dominated Ice Age Europe. We have encountered the Denisovans, the ghost species known more through their genetic legacy than through their physical remains. We have marveled at Homo floresiensis, the small-bodied, small-brained species that defied all our assumptions about the relationship between brain size and capability. And we have noted the existence of Homo luzonensis, yet another island species whose discovery expanded the map of human diversity in ways we had not anticipated. But there is so much more to tell, so much more to understand, so many questions that remain unanswered, so many mysteries that remain unsolved, so many stories that remain untold. The second part of this documentary will take us deeper into these questions. It will explore the dynamics of coexistence between different human species, the mechanisms of extinction, the role of environment and climate, and the profound implications of our genetic entanglement with species that no longer exist. It will ask what happened during those crucial millennia when the world transitioned from a place of many humans to a place of one. And it will ask what it means for us today to carry within our bodies the genetic echoes of species that vanished tens of thousands of years ago. The answers will challenge us, they will surprise us, and they will remind us once again that the human story is not a simple one. It is not a story of triumph or of tragedy alone. It is a story of complexity, of interconnection, of loss and survival, of endings and beginnings. It is, in the deepest sense, our story, all of ours, including the stories of those who are no longer here to tell their own. We were not alone, and in the ways that matter most, we still are not, because they live on in us, in our bones, in our blood, in our genes, in our memories, in the very essence of what it means to be human. This is where part one of our documentary comes to a close, but the story continues. The past is not finished with us yet, and there is so much more to discover, so much more to understand, so much more to remember. Stay with us. The first part of this documentary took us on a journey through the landscape of human diversity as it once existed, a world populated by multiple species of humans, each adapted to its own environment, each carrying its own unique biological and cultural heritage. We met the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, and Homo luzonensis. We examined the evidence for their intelligence, their complexity, their capacity for behavior that we once thought was exclusively our own. And we ended with a question, the question that haunts this entire story: Why are they gone? That question will be at the center of this second part. But it is not the only question we will ask. We will also ask what it means to lose an entire species. We will ask what the world looked like during those crucial millennia when the transition from many human species to one was taking place. We will ask what the survivors, our own ancestors, experienced during that transition and what legacy they carried forward from their encounters with their vanished relatives. And we will ask what all of this tells us about ourselves, about the nature of our species, and about the responsibilities that come with being the last humans standing on a planet that was once shared. These are not easy questions. They do not have simple answers, but they are among the most important questions we can ask because they go to the heart of what it means to be human and what it means to be alone. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. To understand the extinction of the other human species, we need to begin by understanding the world in which those extinctions took place. We need to understand the environment, the climate, and the broader ecological context in which the final chapters of each species were written. Because extinction is rarely a simple story of one thing going wrong, it is almost always a story of multiple pressures converging at a critical moment, each one manageable in isolation, but collectively overwhelming. The period between roughly 100,000 and 30,000 years ago was one of the most climatically turbulent in the recent geological record. The Earth was cycling between glacial and interglacial conditions, with temperatures swinging by as much as 10 degrees Celsius over periods of just a few thousand years. These changes were not gradual and imperceptible. They were rapid and dramatic by geological standards, though still slow relative to a human lifetime. They reshaped ecosystems, shifted vegetation zones, altered the distribution of animal species, and fundamentally changed the environments in which human species lived. For the Neanderthals, who had been adapted to the cold, harsh environments of Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, these climate swings represented a familiar challenge. They had survived multiple glacial cycles. They had adapted their behavior, their diet, and their technology to changing conditions. They had retreated to refugia during the most extreme cold periods and expanded again during warmer interludes. They were, in many respects, remarkably resilient. But the climate changes of the late Pleistocene were particularly severe and particularly rapid. The period between 45,000 and 30,000 years ago was characterized by a series of rapid climatic oscillations, known as Dansgaard Easter events, in which temperatures in the North Atlantic region swung dramatically over periods of centuries or even decades. These rapid changes would have repeatedly disrupted the ecosystems on which the Neanderthals depended, causing sudden shifts in the distribution of prey animals, the availability of plant foods, and the accessibility of different parts of their territory. At the same time, another pressure was building. Modern humans were arriving in Europe. The expansion of Homo sapiens out of Africa and into Eurasia is one of the most consequential events in the history of our species. Beginning roughly 70,000 years ago, possibly earlier, modern humans began moving out of Africa in waves, spreading across the Arabian Peninsula into South Asia and eventually into East Asia, Australia, and Europe. By around 45,000 years ago, modern humans were present in Europe, and by 30,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone. The timing of this sequence, the arrival of modern humans followed by the disappearance of the Neanderthals, has fueled decades of debate. Was it a coincidence? Was it a direct causal relationship? Did modern humans kill the Neanderthals, outcompete them, infect them with diseases, or simply absorb them through interbreeding? Or was the disappearance of the Neanderthals primarily driven by the climate changes that were occurring independently of the human migration? The debate has been fierce, and it has not been fully resolved. But the weight of evidence has shifted significantly in recent years, and the emerging consensus is that the extinction of the Neanderthals was the result of multiple interacting factors, with the arrival of modern humans playing a significant but not necessarily the sole role. Let us consider the different possible mechanisms of extinction, examining each one in turn. The first and most dramatic possibility is direct conflict. Perhaps modern humans simply killed the Neanderthals, engaging in systematic violence that reduced their populations until none remained. This idea has a long history in popular culture, where Neanderthals are often portrayed as brutes who were overpowered by the superior warriors of Homo sapiens. It also has a certain intuitive appeal, because we know that violence between human groups has been a recurring feature of our species' history. But the direct conflict hypothesis faces serious evidential challenges. If modern humans systematically hunted or massacred Neanderthals, we might expect to find evidence of such violence in the archaeological record. Neanderthal bones bearing the marks of weapons, sites showing evidence of large-scale killing and butchering of Neanderthal bodies, or other signs of systematic violence. Such evidence is largely absent. There are a small number of Neanderthal bones that show possible signs of cut marks or other modifications, but these are rare and their interpretation is contested. The overwhelming majority of Neanderthal remains show no signs of violent death. This does not mean that violence never occurred between modern humans and Neanderthals. It almost certainly did, given what we know about the propensity of all human groups for territorial conflict. But it was probably sporadic and opportunistic rather than systematic and genocidal. A small number of violent encounters spread over thousands of years would leave little trace in the fossil record, and such encounters, even if relatively common, would probably not be sufficient on their own to drive an entire species to extinction. Moreover, the Neanderthal population, while never very large, was distributed across a vast territory. Wiping out such a dispersed population through direct violence alone would have been an enormously difficult undertaking, requiring levels of coordination and sustained effort that seem unlikely given what we know about the social organization of late Paleolithic humans. The second possibility is competitive exclusion. Perhaps modern humans did not kill Neanderthals directly but simply outcompeted them for resources, leaving them without enough food, shelter, or territory to sustain viable populations. This hypothesis is grounded in well-established ecological theory. When two species occupy the same ecological niche, the more competitive species will eventually displace the other, either through superior efficiency in resource acquisition, superior reproductive success, or both. The competitive exclusion hypothesis has a great deal going for it. Modern humans did possess certain advantages over Neanderthals that might have translated into competitive superiority. They had more sophisticated projectile weapons, including spear throwers and eventually bows and arrows, that allowed them to hunt from a distance with greater efficiency and less risk of injury than the close-range thrusting spears used by Neanderthals. They had broader social networks that allowed them to share information, trade resources, and coordinate activities over larger geographic areas. They may have had more efficient hunting strategies, capable of exploiting a wider range of prey species. Modern humans also appear to have been more flexible in their diet. While Neanderthals relied heavily on large game, modern humans supplemented their diet with a wider range of foods, including fish, shellfish, birds, and small mammals, as well as a greater variety of plant foods. This dietary breadth would have been advantageous in times of environmental stress, when large game was scarce, and it would have allowed modern human populations to exploit a wider range of habitats. If modern humans were more efficient hunters and foragers than Neanderthals, they could have supported larger population densities in the same territory. Larger populations would have given them a numerical advantage in any direct competition, and they would have been less vulnerable to the kind of population crashes that can lead to extinction in small populations. Over time, even a modest advantage in resource acquisition and population density could have tipped the balance decisively in favor of modern humans. Modeling studies have supported this hypothesis. Mathematical models of the interaction between modern human and Neanderthal populations, incorporating realistic parameters for population size, growth rate, and resource competition, have shown that even a small difference in competitive efficiency could lead to the extinction of Neanderthals over thousands of years, without any direct violence or other dramatic events. The process would have been slow, almost imperceptible on a human timescale, a gradual shrinkage of Neanderthal populations as their territories were encroached upon and their resources diminished, until eventually the populations became too small to sustain themselves and collapsed. This kind of slow, invisible displacement is consistent with the archaeological record, which shows a gradual pattern of Neanderthal decline rather than a sudden disappearance. In some regions, Neanderthal populations appear to have persisted in refugia, isolated pockets of suitable habitat, for thousands of years after modern humans had occupied surrounding areas. The last known Neanderthals, who lived in caves along the southern coast of the Iberian Peninsula, may have survived there until as recently as 37,000 years ago, long after their relatives elsewhere in Europe had disappeared. The third possibility, and one that is often underestimated in popular accounts of Neanderthal extinction, is disease. When two human populations that have been isolated from each other for a long time come into contact, the exchange of pathogens can have devastating consequences for one or both groups. This is because different populations, adapted to different environments and exposed to different microorganisms, will have developed different immune responses. A pathogen that is relatively harmless in a population that has evolved resistance to it can be catastrophic in a population that has never been exposed to it before. We know from historical examples how devastating such disease exchanges can be. The arrival of European populations in the Americas after 1492 was followed by epidemics that wiped out enormous proportions of indigenous populations. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other diseases to which Europeans had some degree of immunity were completely novel to indigenous populations, whose immune systems had no prior experience with these pathogens. The resulting mortality was catastrophic, with some estimates suggesting that 90% or more of indigenous populations in some regions died within a century of first contact. Could a similar process have occurred when modern humans met Neanderthals? It is certainly possible. Modern humans, who had spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to the diverse disease environments of Africa and other regions, might have carried pathogens to which they were largely resistant, but to which Neanderthals, long isolated in Europe and Western Asia, had never been exposed. Even a relatively mild pathogen in an immunologically naive population can cause devastating mortality, particularly in a population that is already small and under stress from other environmental pressures. The disease hypothesis is difficult to test directly because viruses and bacteria rarely leave traces in the archaeological or fossil record. We cannot examine Neanderthal bones for signs of specific infectious diseases in most cases, and we cannot sequence Neanderthal DNA for evidence of specific immune responses with enough detail to determine what pathogens they might have been vulnerable to. But the plausibility of the hypothesis is high, and it may well have been an important contributing factor in the decline of Neanderthal populations. Some researchers have argued that the disease hypothesis alone could account for the extinction of the Neanderthals without needing to invoke competition or violence. In this scenario, modern humans brought novel diseases with them as they expanded into Europe. These diseases swept through the Neanderthal population, reducing their numbers dramatically and leaving the survivors too few and too scattered to sustain viable populations. Once the population had been reduced below a critical threshold, it could not recover, even in the absence of further human pressure. A fourth factor that contributed to the extinction of other human species was the loss of genetic diversity. Small, isolated populations are vulnerable to a phenomenon known as genetic drift, in which random fluctuations in gene frequencies can lead to the loss of beneficial gene variants and the accumulation of harmful ones. In a large population, these random fluctuations average out, and the overall genetic composition remains relatively stable. But in a small population, chance events can have a disproportionate effect, leading to what geneticists call inbreeding depression, a reduction in fitness caused by the increased prevalence of harmful recessive genes. The Neanderthal genome shows clear signs of small population size and inbreeding. The genomes of individual Neanderthals show very low genetic diversity, much lower than that of modern humans, indicating that the total Neanderthal population was probably never very large and that different groups had limited genetic exchange with one another. Some Neanderthal individuals show evidence of close inbreeding, with their parents likely being closely related to each other. This low genetic diversity would have had consequences for Neanderthal fitness. It would have increased the prevalence of genetic diseases, reduced the ability of the immune system to recognize a diverse range of pathogens, and limited the range of adaptive responses available to populations facing environmental challenges. A population with low genetic diversity is less resilient than one with high diversity because it has a smaller toolkit of genetic variants to draw upon when circumstances change. This genetic vulnerability may have made the Neanderthals particularly susceptible to the pressures of the late Pleistocene, including the rapid climate changes, the increased competition from modern humans, and the possible introduction of novel diseases. Their low genetic diversity meant that when things went wrong, they had fewer resources to fall back on. They were, in genetic terms, fragile, a species operating close to the edge of viability. When we consider all of these factors together, climate change, competitive displacement, disease, and genetic vulnerability, we begin to see the extinction of the Neanderthals not as a single dramatic event, but as the culmination of a long process of decline. Each factor contributed something to the overall pressure on Neanderthal populations. No single factor was, by itself, necessarily fatal. But together they created a perfect storm that the Neanderthals, despite their remarkable resilience and adaptability, could not survive. This process played out over thousands of years and varied from region to region. In some areas, Neanderthals may have disappeared relatively quickly after the arrival of modern humans. In others, they persisted for much longer, perhaps maintaining viable populations in refugia where modern human competition was less intense. The genetic evidence tells us that interbreeding occurred at some point, and possibly at multiple points during this process of decline, adding another layer of complexity to the story. The final disappearance of the Neanderthals, whenever and wherever it occurred, was not a single moment. It was a threshold, a point below which the population could no longer sustain itself, from which there was no recovery. The last Neanderthals did not know they were the last of their kind. They did not know that the population had shrunk to the point of no return, that the ecological and demographic conditions that had sustained their species for 300,000 years had finally, irreversibly shifted. They simply lived and hunted and sheltered in their caves, and then they did not, and the world moved on without them. The story of the Denisovans' extinction is even more obscure than that of the Neanderthals, because we know so little about where they lived, how large their populations were, or exactly when they disappeared. The genetic evidence suggests that they were present across a vast area of Asia, from Siberia to Southeast Asia, until at least 40 to 50,000 years ago. They interbred with modern humans at least twice, possibly more, and then they were gone. The same general factors that drove the Neanderthals to extinction were probably at play in the case of the Denisovans as well. Modern humans expanding into Asia would have encountered Denisovan populations, competed with them for resources, possibly introduced novel diseases, and gradually displaced them from their territories. The eventual absorption of some Denisovans into modern human gene pools through interbreeding may have contributed to the dilution and eventual disappearance of distinct Denisovan populations, as small Denisovan groups were absorbed into the larger and more rapidly growing modern human populations. The Denisovans of the Tibetan Plateau may have been among the last to go, if the adaptation to high altitude that they bequeathed to modern Tibetans is any guide. At extreme altitudes, the selective pressure for the EPAS1 variant would have been strong, meaning that the Denisovan population on the plateau may have been specifically and efficiently adapted to that environment. It is possible that Denisovans persisted in these extreme environments longer than their lowland relatives, shielded by the altitude from the full competitive pressure of expanding modern human populations. Eventually, though, modern humans colonized the high plateaus as well, and the last Denisovan populations, wherever they were, met the same fate as all the others. What we can say with confidence is that the Denisovans left a legacy that no other extinct human species has matched. Their genetic contribution to living populations across Asia and the Pacific is substantial, in some cases comparable in magnitude to the Neanderthal contribution to non-African modern humans. And in the case of the Tibetan high-altitude adaptation, their legacy is not just present but actively beneficial, continuing to shape the lives of millions of people today. The Denisovans are gone, but they are not entirely absent. They persist in us, and through us, they continue to shape the human story. The extinction of Homo floresiensis presents yet another set of questions, because the circumstances surrounding it are different from those of either the Neanderthals or the Denisovans. Homo floresiensis was an island species, isolated from the mainland and from any direct competition with modern humans for most of its existence. Its extinction appears to have occurred around 50,000 years ago, around the time that modern humans first arrived in the region. But the connection between the arrival of modern humans and the disappearance of Homo floresiensis is not as direct or as well documented as one might expect. One of the challenges in understanding the extinction of Homo floresiensis is the nature of the evidence from Liang Bua Cave. The cave's sedimentary record shows a gap, a period for which evidence of occupation is absent that may coincide with the time of extinction. Below this gap, there are abundant remains of Homo floresiensis, along with their tools and the animals they hunted. Above it, the situation changes. The stone tools found in the upper levels of the cave are different, more sophisticated, associated with a modern human technological tradition, and the remains of Homo floresiensis are absent. This pattern suggests a transition, a point at which Homo floresiensis disappeared from Liang Bua and modern humans arrived, but the relationship between these two events is unclear. Did modern humans arrive and directly displace or kill the Floresiensis population? Did Floresiensis go extinct for other reasons and modern humans simply moved into an already vacant cave? Or was there a period of overlap, of coexistence, in which modern humans and Floresiensis shared the island before the smaller species finally disappeared? We do not know. The evidence is not sufficient to distinguish between these possibilities. What we do know is that Homo floresiensis had survived on Flores for at least 70,000 years, possibly much longer, and that the species was ultimately unable to persist into the modern era. Whether the cause was competition, disease, climate change, volcanic eruption, Flores is a volcanically active island, and at least one major eruption occurred during the time of Floresiensis occupation, or some combination of these factors. The result was the same. A species that had thrived on its island home for tens of thousands of years was gone. The extinction of Homo floresiensis is particularly poignant because of the species' remarkable nature. Here was a human species that had miniaturized over hundreds of thousands of years, that had adapted to a unique island ecosystem, that had developed a small but capable brain that allowed it to make sophisticated tools and hunt large animals. It was a unique evolutionary experiment, a demonstration of what human evolution could produce under the specific pressures of island isolation. And it was lost, along with everything that it knew and everything that it was. For Homo luzonensis, the story is even more fragmentary. We know so little about this species that reconstructing the circumstances of its extinction is nearly impossible. What we can say is that it existed at least 67,000 years ago, and that modern humans were present in the Philippines by at least some tens of thousands of years ago. Whether the two species ever overlapped in time on Luzon, whether they ever encountered each other, whether modern humans played any role in the extinction of Homo luzonensis, is entirely unknown. The fate of Homo luzonensis may have been similar to that of Homo floresiensis, a gradual decline in the face of multiple pressures, with the arrival of modern humans representing the final stressor that pushed already vulnerable populations past the point of no return. Or the extinction may have occurred earlier, before modern humans arrived, driven by climate change or ecological disruption alone. We simply do not have enough evidence to know. What the existence of Homo luzonensis tells us, even in the absence of information about its extinction, is that human diversity in island Southeast Asia was even greater than we had suspected. If two island human species could exist in the relatively well-studied regions of Flores and Luzon, how many more might have existed on the hundreds of other islands in the archipelago? How many evolutionary experiments were conducted on those isolated patches of land, separated from the mainland and from each other by expanses of ocean? And how many of those experiments ended in extinction, leaving no trace that we have yet found? The incompleteness of our knowledge in this region is humbling. The islands of Southeast Asia are vast in number and varied in character. Many have never been systematically surveyed for archaeological or paleontological evidence. Many of those that have been surveyed have yielded only superficial results, with deeper deposits that might contain older fossils and artifacts remaining unexcavated. The discovery of Homo floresiensis in 2003 and Homo luzonensis in 2019 suggests that the region still holds enormous potential for future discoveries. Each new excavation, each new cave survey, each new fossil find has the potential to reveal yet another chapter in the story of human diversity. While the individual stories of each extinct human species are fascinating in their own right, they take on added significance when we consider them together as part of a larger pattern. The extinction of multiple human species over a period of roughly 50,000 years, coinciding with the global expansion of Homo sapiens, is not a coincidence. It is a pattern, and it demands explanation. The most straightforward explanation, and the one that is supported by the best available evidence, is that the expansion of Homo sapiens was the primary driver of the extinction of other human species. This does not necessarily mean that modern humans deliberately set out to exterminate their relatives. The process was almost certainly more complex and more gradual than that. But the correlation between the arrival of modern humans and the disappearance of other species is too consistent across too many regions to be dismissed as coincidence. This interpretation has uncomfortable implications. It suggests that the first major act of our species on the global stage was the extinction of our closest relatives. Even if this was not intentional, even if it was the unintended consequence of competition, disease, and demographic expansion rather than deliberate violence, it was an extinction event of staggering proportions. Multiple species, each unique, each the product of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, each carrying its own biological and cultural heritage, were wiped off the face of the Earth in what amounts to a geological instant. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the history of our species. As modern humans expanded into new territories, they consistently caused the extinction of large animals, megafauna, through overhunting and habitat modification. The megafaunal extinctions of Australia, the Americas, and other regions followed a now familiar pattern. Large animals that had survived through millions of years of climate changes disappeared rapidly after the arrival of human hunters. The same pattern that may have played out with our human relatives also played out with the animals we hunted. We are, it seems, a species with a particular talent for causing extinction. This is not a comfortable truth, but it is an important one. Understanding our history as a driver of extinction is essential for understanding our current situation and for making informed decisions about how we relate to the other species with which we share the planet. The lessons of the Pleistocene extinctions, including the extinction of our human relatives, are lessons that resonate powerfully in the present day. But let us not dwell exclusively on the darkness of this story. There is another side to the relationship between Homo sapiens and the other human species, one that speaks not of competition and extinction, but of connection and exchange. We have already discussed the genetic evidence for interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals, and between modern humans and Denisovans. We have noted that this interbreeding left a lasting genetic legacy in the genomes of living people, and that some of the genes acquired from Neanderthals and Denisovans have been actively beneficial, helping modern human populations adapt to new environments and resist novel diseases. But the exchange between human species may not have been limited to genetics. It may have extended to culture and technology as well. The question of cultural exchange between modern humans and Neanderthals is one of the most hotly debated in Paleolithic archaeology. When modern humans first arrived in Europe around 45,000 years ago, they brought with them a technological tradition known as the Upper Paleolithic, characterized by a wide variety of stone and bone tools, personal ornaments, and other markers of behavioral modernity. This tradition appears relatively suddenly in the European record, and its contrast with the Mousterian technology of the Neanderthals has traditionally been taken as evidence that modern humans were behaviorally and cognitively superior. But there are complications. In the period immediately before and after the arrival of modern humans in Europe, there appears in the archaeological record a technological tradition known as the chimp-sized, which combines elements of the Mousterian with some of the innovations of the Upper Paleolithic, including personal ornaments. Some researchers have argued that the chimp-sized represents an indigenous Neanderthal innovation, developed by Neanderthals who had contact with modern humans and adopted or adapted elements of their technology. Others have argued that the chimp-sized is actually the work of early modern humans, and that the Neanderthal associations are the result of sediment mixing. The debate is ongoing, and the evidence is genuinely ambiguous. But the very existence of the debate speaks to something important: the possibility that the relationship between modern humans and Neanderthals was not simply one of competition and replacement, but also one of cultural interaction and mutual influence. If Neanderthals did adopt elements of modern human technology, they were demonstrating an ability to learn from other groups, to recognize useful innovations, and to integrate them into their own cultural repertoire. This is a sophisticated cognitive ability, one that is far removed from the stereotype of the brutish, unchanging Neanderthal. Similarly, it is possible that modern humans adopted elements of Neanderthal technology and knowledge, taking advantage of the centuries of experience that Neanderthals had accumulated about the European landscape, its animals, its plants, its seasons, and its hazards. A modern human group entering Europe for the first time would have faced a steep learning curve. The plants and animals of the European Ice Age were different from those of Africa or the Middle East. The climate was harsher, the terrain was unfamiliar. Learning from Neanderthals who had been adapted to this environment for hundreds of thousands of years would have been enormously advantageous. We cannot observe these interactions directly. We can only infer them from the archaeological record, which is fragmentary and difficult to interpret. But the possibility of cultural exchange between modern humans and other species adds another dimension to the story, one that complicates the simple narrative of replacement and suggests that the relationship between different human species was richer and more complex than we have often assumed. The question of what exactly Homo sapiens possessed that other human species did not is central to understanding why we survived when others did not. We have touched on this question before, but it deserves further exploration because the answer is not as simple as it might seem. One approach to this question focuses on technology. Modern humans, particularly in the Upper Paleolithic, developed a remarkably sophisticated and rapidly evolving technological tradition. They invented new tools and weapons at a rate that far exceeded the pace of innovation in Neanderthal or other archaic human populations. They created composite tools combining multiple materials in single implements. They developed projectile weapons that could kill from a distance, dramatically improving the efficiency and safety of hunting. They invented new materials, including bone, antler, ivory, and eventually ceramics, and used them in ways that stone alone could not achieve. This technological dynamism may have given modern humans a decisive advantage. A group equipped with projectile weapons and composite tools can hunt more efficiently, defend itself more effectively, and extract more resources from a given territory than a group relying on simpler technology. Over time, this advantage would translate into larger population sizes and faster rates of territorial expansion. And larger, faster-growing populations have a competitive advantage over smaller, slower-growing ones in virtually any ecological scenario. But why were modern humans more technologically innovative than other species? This is the deeper question, and it leads us to think about cognitive differences and social organization. One hypothesis that has gained significant traction in recent years focuses on the concept of cumulative culture. Cumulative culture is the process by which innovations build upon one another over time, with each generation inheriting and then improving upon the cultural knowledge of the previous generation. It is the foundation of technological progress, the mechanism by which simple stone tools eventually give rise to smartphones and spacecraft. And it requires a specific set of cognitive and social abilities, the ability to learn precisely from others, to understand the intent behind an action rather than just imitating its surface features, to transmit knowledge with high fidelity across generations, and to maintain large enough social networks that innovations can spread and be preserved. Modern humans appear to have been exceptionally good at cumulative culture. Their social networks were larger and more extensive than those of other human species, connecting groups over vast distances and allowing innovations to spread rapidly across space. Their capacity for high-fidelity learning, what psychologists call over-imitation, allowed them to copy not just the general form of a behavior but its precise details, ensuring that technological knowledge was transmitted with minimal degradation. And their use of language, if they had a more fully developed language than other species, would have allowed them to describe and transmit complex, abstract knowledge in ways that gesture and demonstration alone could not. The result was a ratchet effect. Each generation of modern humans inherited the cultural knowledge of the previous generation, added to it, and passed the improved version on to the next. Over time, this process accumulated enormous amounts of technological and ecological knowledge, giving modern human groups a compounding advantage over competing species that lacked the same capacity for cumulative innovation. Neanderthals and other archaic human species were not culturally stagnant. They did innovate. They did develop new tools and new behaviors over time, but the rate of innovation was much slower, and the ratchet mechanism that allowed modern humans to build on past innovations appears to have been less efficient in archaic species. The result was that while Neanderthal technology was sophisticated in absolute terms, it was simply not keeping pace with the rapid cultural evolution of modern humans. Over thousands of years, this gap widened until the technological advantage of modern humans became insurmountable. Another factor that may have contributed to modern human success is demographic. The total population of modern humans, even in the Paleolithic, was probably significantly larger than that of any other human species. Larger populations carry more genetic diversity, which provides resilience against environmental changes. They maintain a larger pool of innovations because more people means more opportunities for novel ideas to arise. They can sustain more complex social structures, including division of labor and specialist roles. And they can recover more quickly from population crashes because the larger the initial population, the more individuals survive a catastrophic event and the faster the population can rebound. The demographic advantage of modern humans was probably not a fixed characteristic but something that grew over time, as modern humans developed more efficient ways of extracting resources and as their social networks became more extensive. In the early stages of contact with Neanderthals or other archaic species, the modern human population may not have been enormously larger. But over time, as modern human populations grew and spread while archaic populations remained stable or declined, the demographic gap widened, reinforcing the competitive advantage that modern humans already held. There's also the matter of ecological flexibility. Modern humans were and remain among the most ecologically flexible species on Earth. They can live in virtually any climate, from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra, from coastal regions to high mountain plateaus. They can eat almost anything. They can adapt their behavior, their technology, and their social organization to an extraordinary range of environmental conditions. This flexibility was a crucial advantage during the turbulent climate changes of the late Pleistocene, when environmental conditions were shifting rapidly and unpredictably. Neanderthals, while also remarkably adaptable by the standards of most species, were more specialized than modern humans. Their anatomy was adapted to cold, open environments. Their diet was heavily dependent on large game. Their technology, while sophisticated, was less diverse than that of modern humans and showed less rapid evolution in response to changing conditions. When the environment shifted dramatically, as it did during the rapid climate oscillations of the late Pleistocene, Neanderthals may have been less able to adjust quickly enough to maintain viable populations. The interplay between all these factors, technological advantage, demographic strength, ecological flexibility, genetic legacy, and the role of chance and circumstance, created a complex dynamic that played out differently in different places and at different times. There was no single moment at which the fate of the Neanderthals or any other human species was sealed. There was instead a gradual process, unfolding over thousands of years, in which small advantages and small disadvantages accumulated until the outcome became inevitable. This process can be illustrated by considering what may have happened when a band of modern humans first encountered a group of Neanderthals. The encounter might have been friendly or hostile, cautious or curious. The two groups might have traded goods or exchanged individuals. They might have fought over territory or game. They might have interbred, producing children who were accepted into one group or the other, or who were rejected and forced to fend for themselves. Over the short term, the outcome of any individual encounter was uncertain. Modern humans did not always win. Neanderthals were stronger and experienced. They knew their territory. They had been living in the same landscape for hundreds of thousands of years, and they knew its rhythms and its resources intimately. In any single confrontation, a Neanderthal band might have held its own against a modern human group, perhaps even driven them away. But over the long term, the cumulative effect of thousands of such encounters, combined with the demographic and technological advantages of modern humans, shifted the balance inexorably. Modern human populations grew. Neanderthal populations shrank. The territory available to Neanderthals contracted. The resources they depended upon became scarcer, partly because of competition and partly because of climate change. The gene pool of surviving Neanderthals became smaller and less diverse, increasing genetic vulnerability. And eventually, somewhere, the last Neanderthal group dwindled below the threshold of viability, and a species that had existed for 300,000 years was no more. What was lost when the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and the other human species disappeared? This is a question that goes beyond biology and archaeology into the realm of philosophy and ethics. Because what was lost was not just a species, not just a collection of genes and bones. What was lost was a way of being human, a perspective on the world, a set of experiences and understandings that were unique and irreplaceable. The Neanderthals knew things that we do not know. They knew the forests of Ice Age Europe in a way that no modern human has ever known them. They knew which plants were edible and which were poisonous, which stones made the best tools, which caves were warmest in winter, which hunting strategies worked best for which animals. They had accumulated this knowledge over hundreds of thousands of years through direct experience, through observation, and through whatever form of cultural transmission they possessed. It was a store of knowledge and wisdom, adapted to their particular world, and it was lost with them. The Denisovans knew the Tibetan Plateau in a way that no one else has ever known it. They knew how to survive at extreme altitude, how to find food in a landscape that seems barely capable of supporting life, how to navigate the brutal winters and the thin air and the isolation of the roof of the world. They had been there for thousands of years, perhaps tens of thousands of years, long enough to have developed deep and intimate knowledge of that unique environment. And that knowledge, that experiential wisdom, is gone, replaced only by the genetic echo of their high-altitude adaptations. Homo floresiensis knew the island of Flores in the same profound way. They knew where the Stegodon herds moved, where the best stone for tools could be found, which caves were safe and which were occupied by the enormous Komodo dragons that shared their island. They had a relationship with their landscape that was built over generations, a web of knowledge and connection that allowed them to thrive on a remote island for tens of thousands of years. And it is gone. This kind of loss is different from the extinction of a non-human species, though it resembles it in some ways. When we lose a species, we lose a unique evolutionary experiment, a unique set of adaptations, a unique way of engaging with the world. But when we lose a human species, we lose something additional, a unique way of being conscious, of experiencing the world, of understanding and responding to the human condition. We lose a perspective that we can never fully recover or reconstruct, no matter how carefully we study the bones and the tools that are left behind. This is why the study of extinct human species is not just an academic exercise. It is an act of recovery, an attempt to partially compensate for an irreversible loss by reconstructing, as best we can, the nature and the experiences of our vanished relatives. Every fossil that is found, every genome that is sequenced, every tool that is analyzed adds a little more to our understanding of who they were. We cannot bring them back, but we can learn about them. We can remember them. And in remembering them, we can honor the diversity that once existed in the human family and reflect on the consequences of its loss. The genetic legacy of the extinct human species in living populations deserves more detailed exploration, because it represents one of the most direct connections between the ancient past and the living present. The Neanderthal and Denisovan genes that live in modern human genomes are not inert relics. They are active participants in the biology of living people, influencing everything from immune function to skin color to susceptibility to disease. Let us consider the immune system, because this is one of the areas where the contribution of Neanderthal and Denisovan genes has been most clearly demonstrated. The human immune system is enormously complex, involving hundreds of genes that encode proteins responsible for recognizing and responding to a vast array of pathogens. Among the most important of these genes are those in the major histocompatibility complex, or MHC, a cluster of genes that plays a central role in the immune response. Studies have shown that certain MHC variants found in modern non-African humans were inherited from Neanderthals and Denisovans. These variants are not found in purely African populations, whose ancestors did not encounter Neanderthals or Denisovans, and they appear to have been favored by natural selection in the populations that carry them. This suggests that they confer some immune advantage, perhaps helping the immune system recognize pathogens that were common in Europe and Asia, but rare or absent in Africa. The acquisition of Neanderthal immune genes may have been crucial for the survival of modern human populations as they expanded into new territories. Entering a new environment means encountering new pathogens, including bacteria, viruses, and parasites that have evolved in that specific ecosystem, and to which the local fauna may have developed some degree of resistance or tolerance. For modern humans entering Europe and Asia, the local fauna included the Neanderthals and Denisovans, who had been living in those environments for hundreds of thousands of years and had evolved immune responses adapted to local conditions. Acquiring even a few of their immune genes through interbreeding would have given modern human populations a head start in the long process of adaptation to new disease environments. This is a remarkable example of the benefits of genetic diversity. By interbreeding with other human species, modern humans effectively borrowed immune adaptations that had been developed over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution in specific environments. Rather than having to evolve these adaptations from scratch, which would have taken many thousands of years, they acquired them quickly through gene flow. The result was a faster and more effective adaptation to new environments, which may have contributed to the remarkable speed with which modern humans colonized the globe. Other Neanderthal genes affect different aspects of biology. Some variants influence skin and hair pigmentation, contributing to the lighter skin tones that are common in European populations. Lighter skin is advantageous at high latitudes because it allows more efficient synthesis of vitamin D from sunlight, which is less intense at higher latitudes than at the equator. The acquisition of these pigmentation variants from Neanderthals, who had been living in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years and had already adapted to low sunlight conditions, may have helped modern humans adapt more rapidly to the high-latitude environments of northern Europe. Some Neanderthal gene variants affect blood coagulation, influencing the tendency of the blood to clot. These variants may have been advantageous in some contexts, perhaps reducing blood loss from injuries, but they are also associated with increased risk of thrombosis, a condition in which blood clots form inappropriately within blood vessels. This is an example of a Neanderthal genetic legacy that is a double-edged sword, beneficial in some contexts and harmful in others, and whose net effect on modern human health is complex and context-dependent. The Denisovan genetic legacy is similarly multifaceted. We have already discussed the EPAS-1 high-altitude adaptation in Tibetan populations, but there are other examples. Some Denisovan gene variants affect immune function, similar to the Neanderthal examples discussed above. Others influence metabolism and fat storage, potentially related to adaptations to the varying food availability of Denisovan environments. And some Denisovan variants appear in populations across Asia and the Pacific, contributing to the genetic diversity of those populations in ways that are still being characterized. One particularly interesting Denisovan genetic contribution involves populations of the Philippines and nearby islands. These populations carry levels of Denisovan ancestry that are comparable to those of Melanesians, suggesting a history of contact with Denisovans that was distinct from the encounter that introduced Denisovan genes into mainland Asian populations. This observation implies that there were multiple, geographically distinct Denisovan populations, each with its own genetic characteristics, and that modern humans encountered and interbred with different Denisovan groups in different parts of Asia. The full picture of Neanderthal and Denisovan genetic contributions to living humans is still being worked out. With each new study, new variants are identified, new functions are characterized, and new insights into the adaptive significance of archaic genetic material are gained. The field is advancing rapidly, and what we know today represents only a fraction of what will eventually be understood. But even with our current incomplete knowledge, the picture is clear. The extinct human species are not entirely gone. They live on in us, contributing to our biology in ways that are sometimes beneficial, sometimes neutral, and sometimes harmful. Their genetic legacy is a bridge between the deep past and the living present, a reminder that the boundaries between species are permeable, and that the history of human evolution is one of connection as much as separation. The story of our genetic entanglement with other human species also raises profound questions about what it means to be Homo sapiens. If 1 to 4% of the genome of non-African modern humans is of Neanderthal origin, and if additional percentages are of Denisovan origin, at what point does a pure Homo sapiens become a hybrid? At what point does the admixture of genes from other species change the nature of the species itself? These questions are not merely philosophical. They have practical implications for how we understand human biology and human health. If certain disease susceptibilities or resistances are partly the result of inherited archaic genes, then understanding the origins of those genes is important for understanding the biology of the conditions they influence. And if the distribution of archaic genes varies among human populations, as it does, then population-specific differences in disease risk may partly reflect differences in the archaic genetic contribution to those populations. The study of ancient DNA and its implications for modern human health is a rapidly growing field, and it is already producing insights that have practical medical relevance. As the technology for analyzing ancient genomes becomes more sophisticated, and as the database of ancient genomes grows larger, this field will undoubtedly yield many more discoveries. The bones of Neanderthals and Denisovans, preserved in caves for tens of thousands of years, are proving to be an unexpectedly rich source of information about the biology of living people. There is something almost miraculous about this. A Neanderthal who lived 40,000 years ago, who hunted mammoths in the Ice Age landscape of Europe, who built fires in a cave against the cold, who perhaps mourned his dead and decorated his body with pigment, left behind a fragment of his genome that today influences the health and the biology of billions of living people. The connection between that ancient individual and the people who carry his genes today is as direct and as real as the connection between any parent and child, any grandparent and grandchild. The generations between are vastly more numerous, the time that separates them vastly greater, but the biological thread connecting them is unbroken. This is what it means to say that the other human species live on in us. It is not a metaphor. It is a literal biological truth. The Neanderthals are not entirely gone. The Denisovans are not entirely gone. Their genes, their biological information, their evolutionary legacy persists in the genomes of living human beings. We are, in a very real sense, a synthesis of multiple human lineages, the last chapter in a story that began not with a single species but with many. Returning to the question of the extinctions themselves, there is one more factor that deserves consideration: the role of population dynamics and the mathematics of decline. When a population becomes small, it enters a danger zone in which random events can have catastrophic consequences. A drought, a disease, a hard winter, a chance migration of a prey species can reduce a small population dramatically, and the smaller the population, the less able it is to absorb such shocks without suffering irreversible decline. This vulnerability is compounded by the genetic factors we discussed earlier. Small populations lose genetic diversity through drift, accumulate harmful mutations, and become increasingly inbred, all of which reduce their resilience and their ability to adapt. For the Neanderthals, genetic evidence suggests that their total population was always relatively small. Estimates based on genome-wide patterns of genetic diversity suggest that the effective population size of Neanderthals, the number of individuals that contributed to the overall genetic diversity of the species, may have been as low as a few thousand. The actual number of Neanderthals living at any given time was probably larger than this, but not enormously so. Perhaps tens of thousands in total, spread across a territory stretching from the Atlantic to the mountains of Central Asia. Such a population, however competent and adaptable its members might be, is fragile. A series of bad years, a regional famine, an epidemic, a loss of key territories to competing populations, any of these could reduce local populations below the threshold of viability. And when local populations disappear, the metapopulation, the network of interconnected local groups that together constitute the species, loses one of its nodes. The remaining nodes must absorb the loss, or they must expand to fill the vacant territory, but if they are themselves under pressure, they may be unable to do either. Slowly, node by node, the metapopulation shrinks until there are not enough nodes left to sustain the network. This model of extinction through population fragmentation is consistent with the archaeological evidence. The last Neanderthal populations appear to have survived in isolated pockets, particularly along the Atlantic coast of the Iberian Peninsula, where a combination of mild climate, abundant marine resources, and relative isolation from the most intense zones of modern human occupation may have provided a temporary refuge. But even these refugia were eventually overwhelmed, as the expanding modern human population reached even the most remote corners of the European continent. The final extinction of the Neanderthals was thus not a dramatic event, but a quiet one. The last group, wherever it was, simply dwindled. Adults died, births became rarer, children were born but did not survive to reproduce. The population shrank to the point where chance events alone could seal its fate. And then, at some point, there were none left. A species that had endured for 300,000 years was gone. We cannot fully understand the loss of the other human species without also understanding what modern humans were doing during this period, because the expansion of Homo sapiens was not just a story of competition and extinction. It was also a story of extraordinary cultural and cognitive achievement, a period during which our species developed the full suite of behaviors and capabilities that define what we think of as human civilization. The Upper Paleolithic, the period from roughly 45,000 to 12,000 years ago, was a time of explosive cultural innovation. In cave after cave across Europe, archaeologists have found the extraordinary evidence of this innovation. Paintings of bison and horses, mammoths and deer, executed with a naturalistic skill and an aesthetic sensibility that can still move a modern viewer to wonder. Sculptures of human and animal figures, carved from ivory and bone with patient, precise skill. Flutes made from the hollow bones of birds and the tusks of mammoths, the oldest known musical instruments, testifying to the creation of music as a cultural form. Intricate jewelry of shell and bone and ivory, trading goods that crossed hundreds of kilometers and connected distant communities in networks of exchange. The cave paintings of Lascaux, Altamira, Chauvet, and dozens of other sites represent one of the most astonishing achievements of the human mind. The artists who created them were not primitive. They were not fumbling toward expression. They were sophisticated visual thinkers who understood perspective, who used color with skill, who captured the movement and the character of animals with a confidence and an accuracy that speaks of long practice and deep observation. They were artists in every meaningful sense of the word. And yet, these same people were also hunters who drove herds of horses over cliffs and carved mammoths into trophies. They were warriors who fought over territory and resources. They were the species that was, at this very moment, contributing to the extinction of the Neanderthals and transforming the face of Europe. The same minds that produced the art of Lascaux were also the minds that outcompeted, displaced, and possibly helped drive to extinction the species that had called Europe home for hundreds of thousands of years. This duality is at the heart of the human story. We are capable of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary destruction. We create art and we cause extinction. We care for our sick and we drive other species from their homes. We build communities of profound love and cooperation, and we engage in terrible violence against those we perceive as different. The same cognitive capacities that allow us to imagine and create and connect also allow us to plan and scheme and destroy. The Neanderthals were on the receiving end of both sides of this duality. They were perhaps absorbed in part through interbreeding, a form of genetic integration that speaks of attraction and connection. And they were perhaps displaced and diminished in part through competition and conflict, a form of violent exclusion that speaks of the darker aspects of human behavior. The relationship between Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis was, like most human relationships, complicated. As we approach the end of this exploration, it is worth stepping back to consider the larger picture, what the existence and the extinction of multiple human species tells us about the nature of our own species and about our place in the world. One lesson is humility. The story of human evolution is not a story of inevitable progress toward a single, superior endpoint. It is a story of diversity, of multiple experiments in being human, each shaped by the specific circumstances of its time and place. Homo sapiens is not the pinnacle of human evolution. We are one branch on a bush that once had many branches, and the fact that we are the only branch still living is not evidence of our superiority, but of our historical circumstances. Under different conditions, a different branch might have flourished and spread. This is not merely a philosophical point. It has practical implications for how we think about human potential and human diversity. If the history of our genus demonstrates that there are many ways to be human, many different configurations of body and mind and behavior that can thrive and persist under the right conditions, then perhaps we should be less quick to assume that there is a single, correct way to be human. The diversity of the past should inspire us to value and protect the diversity of the present in all its forms. Another lesson is about connection. The genetic evidence of interbreeding between modern humans and other species reveals that the human family tree is not a tree at all, but a web, a network of connections that links different lineages across time and space. We are not the product of a single lineage. We are the product of many lineages, woven together through generations of contact and exchange. The genes of the Neanderthals flow in our veins. The genes of the Denisovans influence our biology. We are, in the most literal sense, made of our relatives, including those who are long gone. This interconnectedness should inform how we think about human identity and human unity. If we are all connected to the same deep roots, if we all carry within us the genetic legacy of the same ancient relatives, then the distinctions we draw between human groups, distinctions of appearance, of culture, of language, of history, are variations on a theme rather than fundamental differences of kind. We are all, ultimately, branches of the same ancient web, connected to each other and to all those who came before us. The mystery of why we are alone today, why only one human species survives when once there were many, is a mystery that continues to fascinate and to disturb. It is a mystery that speaks to our deepest anxieties about our own nature and our own future. Because if we can cause the extinction of our closest relatives, what else are we capable of? And what does our current dominance of the planet say about us? These are questions without easy answers. The causes of the extinction of other human species were multiple and complex, as we have seen. Direct violence may have played a role in some cases. Competition for resources certainly played a role. Disease may have played a role. Climate change played a role, and demographic and genetic vulnerability played a role. The extinctions were the result of a complex interaction of all these factors, unfolding over thousands of years in different ways in different places. What is certain is that the expansion of Homo sapiens was associated with the disappearance of other human species. Whether we take any moral responsibility for that association is a philosophical question rather than a scientific one, but the question is worth asking because it connects the past to the present. We live in an era of another mass extinction, one driven by human activity, the clearing of forests, the hunting of species to extinction, the alteration of climates, the transformation of ecosystems. The processes that may have driven the Neanderthals to extinction are recognizably similar to the processes that are driving species to extinction today. We are, it seems, a species capable of both extraordinary creation and extraordinary destruction. Understanding our past, including the past in which we shared the world with other humans and then watched them disappear, is essential for understanding our present and for making informed choices about our future. The fossil record, incomplete as it is, continues to yield new surprises. Every year, new discoveries are made that add to our understanding of human diversity and human history. New fossils are found that extend the known range of existing species or reveal the existence of previously unknown ones. New genomes are sequenced that reveal new episodes of interbreeding or new details about the populations of ancient species. New dating techniques allow us to establish the ages of fossils and artifacts with greater precision, clarifying the timing of key events in human evolution. The pace of discovery has accelerated dramatically in recent years. The development of ancient DNA analysis has transformed the field, making it possible to extract genetic information from fossils that would previously have yielded no useful data. Improvements in dating technology have resolved long-standing debates about the ages of key sites and fossils. And new survey and excavation techniques have opened up regions that were previously inaccessible, revealing new sites and new finds in parts of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific that are still relatively poorly understood. The regions with the greatest potential for future discoveries include the cave systems of Southeast Asia, where Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis have already been found, and where many caves remain unsurveyed. The highlands of East Africa, where the complex of early human species that preceded and accompanied the origin of Homo sapiens is still not fully understood. The cave systems of Central and East Asia, where Denisovan remains have been found at only a handful of sites despite evidence that the species was widespread across the region. And the deep sediments of some European caves, where the earliest chapters of the Neanderthal story are still obscure. Each of these regions holds the potential for discoveries that could transform our understanding of human evolution as dramatically as the discovery of Homo floresiensis or the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome. The history of the field is a history of surprises, of expectations overturned and assumptions challenged. There is every reason to expect that the surprises will continue. What new species might be waiting to be discovered? What new episodes of interbreeding might be revealed by genetic analysis of ancient samples? What new chapters might be added to the story of human diversity and human extinction? We do not know, and that not knowing is part of what makes this field so exciting. Every new excavation, every new fossil, every new genome is a potential revelation, a new piece of a puzzle that is still far from complete. The story of human evolution, with all its complexity and all its unanswered questions, is ultimately a story about us, about where we came from, how we got here, and what we carry with us from the long journey of our genus through time. It is a story that is still being written, not just in the libraries and laboratories where scientists work, but in the very DNA of every living human being. Every person alive today is a living archive of human history. In our genomes, we carry the record of every migration our ancestors made, every population they encountered, every disease they survived, every environment they adapted to. We carry fragments of Neanderthal DNA and Denisovan DNA, silent witnesses to encounters that took place tens of thousands of years ago. We carry immune genes refined by millions of years of evolution, metabolic genes shaped by the specific diets of specific environments, and countless other variants that reflect the long and complicated history of our species. In this sense, the other human species are not entirely gone. They persist in us, woven into the fabric of our biology. The Neanderthal who painted the wall of a cave in Ice Age Europe, who cared for an injured companion through a long winter, who looked up at the stars and perhaps wondered what they meant, is not entirely absent from the world. Something of that individual persists, diluted and transformed by 40,000 years of genetic mixing, in the DNA of every non-African person alive today. This is both a sobering and a consoling thought. Sobering because it reminds us of the extinction, the irreplaceable loss of a species and all that it was and knew. Consoling because it tells us that the connections between living and dead, between past and present, between the many human species that have existed and the one that remains, are deeper and more intimate than we might have imagined. We are not only ourselves. We are also them, all those who came before, all those who walked alongside us for a time and then were gone, all those whose bones lie in caves and whose genes persist in our blood. We are the synthesis of all those lineages, the current chapter of a story that began millions of years ago and that continues, in ways we cannot fully anticipate, into a future that is yet to be written. As we draw this documentary to a close, let us return to the beginning. to the simple, astonishing fact that for most of human history, we were not alone, that the world we inhabited was shared with other beings who were, in every meaningful sense, human, that we walked under the same stars as beings who looked different from us, who lived differently from us, who understood the world differently from us, but who were our relatives, our neighbors, and, as the genetic evidence shows, our occasional partners. The world that existed 50,000 years ago, before the last of our relatives disappeared, was a richer world than the one we inhabit today. It was a world with more kinds of human experience, more ways of being conscious, more ways of engaging with the challenges and the wonders of existence. The loss of that diversity is real, and it is permanent. No amount of scientific discovery can fully compensate for the actual absence of the Neanderthals and the Denisovans and all the others. But science can give us something else. It can give us knowledge, and with knowledge, understanding. It can tell us who they were, how they lived, and what they left behind. It can reveal the connections between them and us, the genetic and evolutionary threads that bind us together across the millennia. And it can help us appreciate the nature and the magnitude of what was lost so that we might be more thoughtful about what we do with what remains. The world today is still full of diversity, biological diversity, cultural diversity, linguistic diversity. The human species today encompasses an extraordinary range of variation, not just in physical appearance but in ways of life, ways of thought, ways of understanding and relating to the world. This diversity is under threat from many of the same forces that may have driven the other human species to extinction: competition, displacement, the expansion of dominant cultural and economic systems at the expense of smaller and more vulnerable ones. The story of the lost human species is, among other things, a cautionary tale about the value and the fragility of diversity. When we lose a species, we lose something irreplaceable. When we lose a language, a culture, a way of life, we lose something equally irreplaceable. The world is impoverished by each such loss, made less rich, less varied, less interesting than it might have been. The echoes of those losses reverberate through time, and they are felt even if they are not recognized by those who come after. We are the inheritors of the greatest loss in the history of our genus. We are the sole survivors of a family that was once large and diverse. And that inheritance carries with it a responsibility, not just to understand the past, but to be more thoughtful about the future, to recognize the value of diversity in all its forms, to resist the impulse toward uniformity and dominance that has, in the past, contributed to the disappearance of irreplaceable forms of life and experience. And to remember always that we did not achieve our current position in the world through inherent superiority, but through a combination of capability, circumstance, and luck. The Neanderthals were human, the Denisovans were human, Homo floresiensis was human, Homo luzonensis was human. They were not lesser versions of us, not failed experiments, not stepping stones on the way to our own perfection. They were complete in themselves, each adapted to its own world, each capable of its own forms of intelligence and culture and perhaps even beauty. And they are gone. We should remember them, not with sentimentality, but with the full understanding of what their existence meant and what their loss represents. We should remember them as we would remember anyone who was once part of our family and is now gone, with respect, with curiosity. With the acknowledgement that their story is part of our story, and that understanding it makes us more fully who we are. The human story did not begin with us. It began long before us, with our ancestors and their ancestors and the ancestors of all the other human species that have walked this earth. It began with fire and stone, with cave and sky, with the long, slow process of evolution that shaped a dozen different kinds of human out of the raw material of ancient primate populations. And it continues today in us, in all the complexity and the beauty and the darkness and the light that we carry with us as the inheritors of that long history. We were not alone. We were never alone for most of our existence. And even now, in our solitude, we carry the others with us in our genes, in our knowledge, and in the stories we tell about who we are and where we came from. Their presence in us is the deepest truth of our existence, and honoring that presence by learning about them and remembering them is the least and the most we can do for those who shared our world and then were gone. The search continues. In caves not yet excavated, in sediments not yet sampled, in genomes not yet sequenced, in discoveries not yet made, the story of our lost relatives is not finished. There are more chapters to be written, more species to be discovered, more connections to be revealed. The past is not closed. It is still speaking to us in the language of bone and stone and DNA, and we are only beginning to understand what it is saying. This is the story of when we were not alone. It is a story of extraordinary diversity and heartbreaking loss, of connection and separation, of survival and extinction, of what it means to be human in a world that is always larger and more complex than our understanding of it. It is our story in the deepest and most complete sense, and it is a story that will never be entirely finished, because as long as we live, the echoes of those other lives, those other ways of being human, continue to resonate in everything we are. We were not alone, and in the ways that matter most, in the genes we carry and the history we share and the story we tell, we are not entirely alone even now.